The Kansas sky at 3 in the afternoon should not be that color. Yellow at the crown, green at the horizon. The color of a bruise that has been waiting 11 years to show. A thermometer nailed to a general store post reads 18 above zero. In 90 minutes, it will read 40 below. The wind has not arrived yet. That is the worst of it. 3 miles north, a limestone bluff rises out of the buffalo grass like a broken tooth. Smoke curls from a fieldstone chimney set into rock the county assessor once called worthless. An oak door 3 inches thick waits at the mouth of a cave. Behind that door, two young women are setting 27 tin plates on a pine table they built with their own hands. They have counted the plates twice. They know exactly who is coming up that bluff tonight. They know because they were warned. They know because they warned everyone else first. And nobody listened. The sky over Stoneford Bend, Kansas turned the color of an old bruise on the afternoon of January 11th, 1888. Yellow at the top, gray at the middle, a sickly green at the horizon where no sky was ever meant to go. At 3 o'clock, the thermometer nailed to the post outside the general store read 18 above zero. A cold day for a farmer to be out, nothing more. 3 hours later, that same thermometer would read 40 below, and the wind would already have taken the roof off the schoolhouse. 14 souls in that little Kansas town would not see the sunrise. Cattle would freeze on their feet still chewing. A boy walking home with his lunch pail would simply be gone, pail and all, as if the prairie had reached up and swallowed him whole. But 3 miles north of that dying town, up on a limestone bluff, the county assessor had once written off as worthless rock something impossible was happening. Behind a heavy oak door set 20 feet deep into the mouth of a cave, the air held steady at 55 degrees. A small cast-iron stove crackled with hardwood. A pot of venison stew murmured on the flat top. And two young women sisters, orphans girls the town had spit on for 9 straight months, were setting 27 extra tin plates on a long pine table they had built with their own hands. They knew who was coming. They had known for 2 days. They had counted the plates twice. The man who had paid a 14-year-old boy $2 silver to burn their woodpile was on that list. The school teacher who had told her class the Thornhill sisters were a public menace was on that list. The mayor who had signed their deed with pity thin as onion skin in his voice was on that list. Every last one of them, before the second dawn of the storm, would come crawling up that bluff on hands turned black by frostbite, and the oak door would open, and the older sister would step aside without a single word of triumph on her face. That is where this story ends. This is where it began. The morning they were put out of Haven Hill Home for Foundlings in Philadelphia, it was raining. Not hard, just the thin, patient rain that soaks through wool inside of a mile and makes a walk to the depot feel like a slow accusation. Hollis Thornhill was 21 years old that April. Her hair the color of dark honey pulled back into a knot she had tied so tight her scalp ached. Her mouth set in a line so still a stranger might have called it cruel and been wrong. Her sister Sable was 15 years, thin as a fence rail, still coughing. The little dry cough she had picked up the winter she was 6 and never quite put down. Between them on the cracked stone step sat one small pine suitcase. Inside were 2 mended dresses, 1 Bible their mother had left them, a bone-handled hairbrush, a tin of eucalyptus salve for the cough, and folded into a canvas pocket sewn along the lining, a stack of 27 sealed letters neither girl yet knew existed. Sister Honora Trask stood in the doorway with her arms folded across a black wool habit that had gone shiny at the elbows from 30 years of leaning on the same door frames. She was not a cruel woman. She was a tired one, and tired women, when the paperwork demands, it will do cruel things and call them procedure. Her eyes stayed on the wet flagstones. Her voice came out flat as pressed linen. The charter says 21 is the end of it. Hollis did not lift her chin. Yes, ma'am. The child cannot stay without a legal guardian on the grounds. Yes, ma'am. There are $40 in the envelope. Discretionary fund. Do not spend it foolishly. Yes, ma'am. Then the older woman's gaze finally rose past Hollis, past Sable, out into the rain, and it landed on nothing at all. Hollis. Ma'am, I am sorry it has to be this way. I know. No, I am truly sorry. The door closed, the bolt slid, the rain kept coming. Sable cried the whole walk to Broad Street Station, cried the way she always cried, silent water running down a face that was still too small for the world it was being asked to look at. Hollis did not cry. Hollis had learned at 9 years old on the afternoon their mother was lowered into the ground, and their father did not come. that if she cried, Sable would break, and Sable was made of a finer material, and finer material breaks first. So she carried the suitcase in one hand and her sister's hand in the other, and she kept her jaw locked and she kept walking, and somewhere between 12th and Market, she understood without any drama about it that from this hour forward there was nobody in the world whose job it was to catch either of them if they fell. They found a bench inside the depot beneath a soot-blackened skylight. Hollis knelt and opened the suitcase to see what could be eaten before what could be spent. And it was under the second folded dress under the salve tin that her fingers brushed the little canvas pouch stitched to the lining. She had never noticed it before. She almost did not notice it now. Inside were the letters packed tight, edges yellowed, some smelling faintly of wood smoke, some faintly of prairie sage, though she did not yet know what that smell was called. 27 envelopes, every one addressed in the same spidery slanted hand. Miss Hollis Thornhill, Miss Sable Thornhill, care of Haven Hill Home, every single one still sealed. Hollis's fingers began to shake in a way that was new to her, the kind of shake that comes not from cold or hunger, but from a hinge inside the chest turning on itself. She opened the topmost letter, postmarked November of 1886. 2 months before then, she read aloud because Sable deserved to hear it in a voice the child loved. My dearest girls, I do not know if you will ever read this. I have written every month for 9 years. Perhaps you have read them all, perhaps none. Perhaps you have decided you do not wish to know me, and if so, I understand, God bless. But the doctor says this fever will not last much longer this time, so I write once more in case. If you have not answered because you did not receive, please come. There is a piece of land in Kansas with your name written on the deed. There is a Bible on the shelf that was your grandfather's. There is a rocker by the hearth that was your mother's when she was small enough to fit in it. I have kept everything. I have prayed for you every night for 12 years. I have loved you since before I ever saw your faces. Your loving grandmother always. Mercy Kettleworth. Sable's breath caught small in her throat. We have a grandmother. Hollis's voice came slow, careful, like a woman stepping across river ice. We had a grandmother. Where is she? Hollis looked down at the other 26 envelopes, and the arithmetic of it landed in her. All at once, the shape of 9 years' worth of a stranger's love, intercepted at a Philadelphia mail slot by a tired woman who had that morning closed a door on their faces because the charter said 21. Kansas. How the train? The train goes there. Sister. Yes. How long has she been writing? Hollis lifted the pouch, tilted it toward the gaslight. 9 years, 1 a month, sometimes 2. And nobody. Hollis said nothing. Sable's face did something then that Hollis would remember for the rest of her life, a small collapse and then a small hardening, as if the girl had decided in the space of half a breath to grow up 2 years on the depot bench. Sister, what if we are too late? Hollis had already made the decision before the question finished. She stood, brushed her skirt, walked to the ticket window with the coins counted out in her palm. The clerk, a bald man with ink on his cuffs, had never heard of Stoneford Bend and had to run a finger down a schedule book to find it. $31 for 2 passages changing at Fort Dodge for a stage. That would leave them $9 against the world. Hollis paid. She came back to the bench and told her sister to eat half of the loaf and save half for Ohio, and while Sable chewed her bread with wet cheeks, Hollis opened the second letter and the third and read them one at a time in the order the postmarks had marched them out. 9 years of a woman writing into an empty room, keeping the faith that the room was not empty. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, Sable fell asleep against Hollis's shoulder with the crumbs of the bread still on her lip. Hollis read on alone. The last letter Mercy Kettleworth ever wrote to her granddaughters was dated the 3rd week of December 1886. 3 weeks, Hollis would learn later, before the woman was in the ground. The handwriting had gone thin as thread, the letters half formed, but the sentences ran true. Girls, if you come, I have left you the land. It is on the bluff north of town. Ask for me at the church. Reverend Pettigrew will know what to do. Do not be afraid of the size of the world. It is not as big as it wants you to believe. I am not afraid. Grandmother. Ohio at 3 in the morning, with the coal smoke pressing against the compartment glass and the wheels grinding out their long iron sentence beneath her. Hollis Thornhill wept quietly, so her sister would not wake for a woman who had prayed for her every night for 12 years. For 9 Christmases that had come and gone in a Philadelphia dormitory with no word from Kansas because the word had all been locked in a canvas pocket for a grandmother she was already too late to hold. The train took them as far as Fort Dodge. From Fort Dodge, a mail wagon 2 days west on ruts frozen in the mornings and sucking mud in the afternoons. From the end of that wagon, a supply cart one more day. From the end of the cart, 6 miles on foot, with the pine suitcase changing hands every 100 yards. They came into Stoneford Bend from the east on the 19th of April, 1887. So tired their eyes had begun to invent kindnesses that were not really being offered. Stoneford Bend was not much of a town. One packed dirt main, a small clapboard church at the north end with a bell tower missing a shutter, a general store with a porch that sagged at the west corner, a land office, a saloon that had been named the Watering Trough because a sign painter had come cheap, a one-room schoolhouse painted white last summer, 24 houses fanned out into the prairie along 3 rutted lanes. 150 souls, give or take. That was what the supply cart driver had said, and he had spit into the dust and added most of them mean. Hollis had not asked him why. She had a feeling she was about to find out. They knocked at the small clapboard house beside the church. The man who opened the door was 72 years old, tall, once bent, now his white hair combed with the terrible neatness of a man who lived alone and refused to let it show. His eyes were the color of the September sky over the sand hills, and when they landed on Hollis's face, and then on Sable's face, and then on Hollis's face again, his hand went to his mouth as if he had been struck. His voice, when it came, was hardly a voice at all. "Oh, then, oh dear God in heaven, you came." Hollis steadied herself on the doorframe. "Reverend Pettigrew." "Girls, come in. Come inside where it is warm. I have been praying you would come for 3 months. I did not know if I had prayed hard enough." Reverend Ambrose Pettigrew fed them boiled eggs, thick slices of ham, hot milk with brown sugar melted into it, and the last of a peach preserve his wife had put up 11 years ago, and that he had been rationing since she died. Sable ate so fast, she choked and had to be patted between the shoulder blades, and the old man's eyes filled and did not empty for a long time. He kept dabbing them with a handkerchief that had been ironed with the sort of terrible care that meant he still ironed it every Monday for a woman who could no longer see the creases. He said at intervals into the steam of his coffee, "Praise be, praise be." When Sable had finished her second egg, he sat down across from them and folded his hands on the pine tabletop and told them in a voice that broke twice and did not apologize for the breaking, that Mercy Kettleworth had passed on the 18th of January, 3 months and 1 day before her granddaughters walked through his door. Sable's small hand crept across the table and closed around Hollis's wrist. Hollis did not move. Her voice came out even. "How? The fever, child. It took 9 here in 6 weeks. Your grandmother was among the last. She was not alone. Miss Verity Lockridge sat up 2 nights with her. I read her the Psalms. She spoke your names at the end. Both of them. She said, 'Tell them I read every letter Sister Trask ever sent me. Tell them I knew what books they liked. Tell them I knew Sable had a cough.'" Sable made a sound then that was not quite crying. Hollis's jaw locked hard enough to hurt. Sister Trask wrote her. Every year in detail. But she did not. No, she did not. A silence sat between them long enough for the stove to pop twice. Hollis heard her own voice quiet and did not recognize the flatness of it. Why? Reverend Pettigrew looked past her at the window as if the answer was outside somewhere, and he had not yet been given permission to fetch it. "I do not know, child. I have my suspicions. Perhaps she feared she would lose the 2 of you to a place she could not see. Perhaps she feared the home would lose its funding if the 2 of you left too soon. There are many sorts of selfishness in a woman who has spent her life caring for other people's children. Some of them God will forgive. Some of them only He can." He rose then, slow, one hand on the small of his back, and crossed to a cupboard and took down a leather envelope tied with a bit of black cord. He set it on the table between them the way a man sets down something that has been waiting a long time to be set down. 160 acres on the bluff north of town. Micajah Redfern will walk it with you tomorrow. He knew your grandfather. He is expecting you. There was a cabin, a small one. She lived in it alone for the last 4 years. It was burned by order of the health committee after she passed. Fever in the walls, or so they said. I am sorry. There was nothing I could do. He opened the leather envelope. He drew out three things and lined them along the pine boards between the tin cups. A small notebook bound in cracked leather and knotted at the spine with a bit of twine. A well-used Bible black, its cover softened to something almost warm to the touch, a scrap of red ribbon marking a page. A folded sheet of paper gone yellow at the creases. His fingertips lingered on each object as if introducing them one by one. The notebook was your grandfather's. Elias Kettleworth was a geologist. He surveyed this county before the rail even thought of coming through. He died in '68 when your mother was 11. Your grandmother kept it on her bedside table for 20 years. A pause. The Bible was hers. She marked it up. She was not a woman who left books unmarked. Another pause longer and his fingertips settled on the yellow paper. This she wrote 3 weeks before she passed. She gave it to me herself. She said, if my girls come, give it to them. If they do not come, burn it. You came, so. Hollis's hands would not stop shaking, and she was suddenly furious with them for it, as if they had betrayed some standard she had never spoken aloud. She unfolded the sheet. She read it out because Sable deserved to hear the words in the voice the child loved best in the world. My dearest girls, I do not know if you will ever read this. I have prayed you would. I have prayed you would not, because to read this means I am gone before I could hold you. If you have come and I am not here, hear me. I live my whole life alone, not friendless, not without God, but without the small hands of my daughter's daughters in my own. That was the ache I could not fix. If you have come, do not let another child feel it. Live so that no child in this county is ever as alone as I was. That is the whole of it. Your loving grandmother always. Mercy. Nobody spoke for what felt like a long time. Reverend Pettigrew's handkerchief came out again and was folded and pocketed with the same terrible care as before. Sable lifted the Bible off the pine table and pressed it flat against her chest without opening it. Not yet. She was not ready yet. Hollis did not blame her. Reverend. Yes, child. Where can we sleep tonight? Here, my wife's sewing room. Nothing in it has been moved in 11 years. There is a bed, 2 blankets. I will not charge you a cent. Reverend? Yes. Why is this town not going to want us here? His face did something complicated. Not surprise. Something closer to grief. How did you know? The wagon driver told me. And the way you looked at us when you opened the door. Half hope, half worry. A man does not hope and worry at the same time unless there is trouble waiting. He closed his eyes. His hands rested flat on the table. The fever child. It came through here in October. A peddler from somewhere east. Nobody knows exactly where. 9 died in 6 weeks. Stoneford Bend does not know for certain where it came from. It knows only that it came from somewhere in that direction. His finger drifted vaguely toward the door, toward the east, toward Philadelphia. And 2 young women arriving from that direction today. Ah, it is not fair. Reverend, fair is a word for children with 2 parents. My sister and I stopped believing in it a long time ago. He stared at her. Something in his face shifted the way a lantern flame shifts when a door opens somewhere behind you. How old did you say you were? 21. You sound 60. I have had practice. He almost smiled. Almost. Sleep, both of you. Tomorrow will be its own day. Sable slept in the little iron frame bed, or the shape of Sable slept. Hollis was not sure the girl was truly under, only lying very still, one hand tucked beneath her cheek in the shape she had used since she was 3. Hollis lay awake beside her most of the night, listening to a moonlight square inch its slow way across pine floorboards, worn smooth by a dead woman's slippers, thinking about a grandmother who had prayed for her every night for 12 years, and a matron who had sat in a Philadelphia office writing dispatches on their reading habits to a woman in Kansas whose letters she was at the same hour locking in a lining pouch. Somewhere near midnight, the moonlight touched the leather notebook on the little bedside table, and Hollis, who had not intended to open it, opened it just to look at the shape her grandfather's letters made. The hand was small and careful and precise, the hand of a man who had learned to write in cold barns by the light of a single tallow. She turned a page at random somewhere in the middle. It was a diagram, a cross-section of a limestone bluff drawn in blue pencil with the shading done in a stipple that must have taken an hour of a winter evening. Inside the bluff, drawn in the same careful stipple, was a cave, and inside the cave, set back 20 feet from the opening, was a cabin. 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, Double plank walls with a 4-inch cavity between them marked with the notation packed sheared wool. A stove. A stovepipe running not out the roof, but up through a natural fissure in the limestone ceiling, exiting through a hole marked with the words, "Natural chimney, do not enlarge." In the margin, in the same careful blue pencil hand, a note. Internal temperature holds steady year-round at approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Independent of surface weather. The cave functions as a thermal battery. Ideal shelter for a family in this climate. Would build for M, if she would allow it. Hollis sat up slowly. Her breath had gone uneven. She turned back a page. Barometric readings, months of them tables, in that same handwriting, correlations penciled between column and column. She turned forward. A chapter titled in careful block capitals on the reading of sky. She turned forward again. A page headed simply, "For the girls." She did not read that one yet. She could not. Not tonight. She looked down at Sable, who had turned in her sleep and was breathing evenly at last, and she said to the moonlight in a whisper that did not disturb a single mote of dust in the Reverend's dead wife's sewing room, "Grandfather, you already drew it." Then, to no one at all, or to whichever of the two women whose names she was carrying now was listening, "We are going to build the house." Micajah Redfern came to the Reverend's kitchen at 7 in the morning, with the sun still low and pink in the eastern windows. He was 62, tall and narrow as a fence post, missing his left arm from just below the elbow. A coal shaft accident in Pennsylvania when he was 22 or so. The story went, though, Hollis would later learn there was more to it and less. He had a mule he called Whistle because the animal breathed noisily through one nostril, and he had a habit of speaking one sentence at a time and waiting to see what a person did with it. He accepted a cup of coffee. He drank it slow. He looked at them across the pine boards. "You Elias's girls. His granddaughters. Same thing to me." A pause, another sip. "Your grandfather kept me alive one winter. Fed me 3 months when I had nothing. Never asked for a cent. I owed him." A pause. His pale eyes settled on Sable and softened then on Hollis and did not. "So I owe you anything you need. Mr. Redfern. Micajah, we want to see the land." They walked the 3 miles north out of town in a silence that was not uncomfortable, only full. Past the last fence posts, past a broken windmill leaning south on rotted timber, up a slow rise where the grass began to give way to buffalo grass and yucca, then to shale, then to the pale gray of the limestone that ran under this whole part of Kansas the way iron runs under old blood. The bluff rose 50 feet out of the prairie like a broken tooth. 2 twisted junipers clung to its south face halfway up. There, cut into the south face by 10,000 years of water and wind, was the mouth of a cave, 40 feet wide at the opening, 22 feet high, narrowing back into the hill for 60 feet before it turned and went deeper. The cave from her grandfather's diagram. Alive, real, waiting. Hollis stood at the mouth of it, Sable at her elbow. Micajah Redfern 2 steps behind, his one good arm crossed against his chest, watching, waiting to be told what fool thing these 2 Philadelphia girls thought they had just walked into. Sable's whisper was so soft the wind almost took it. "It is bigger than I thought." Hollis's answer came out flat as a hammered nail. "It is exactly what we needed." Micajah's voice dry. "What you needed." She turned. She met him full in the face. "Micajah, this is 1887. I am aware. We are 2 women with $9 left in the world. We are not going to survive a Kansas winter in a shack we can afford to build. We are going to survive a Kansas winter in the house our grandfather already designed." She handed him the notebook. He took it in his one hand, spread it against his hip, thumbed to the diagram, read it, read the marginalia, turned a page, read that one, turned another. 15 minutes he stood at the cave mouth reading. 15 minutes she did not breathe. He closed the notebook. He handed it back. "Girl, I will start hauling pine tomorrow." "Micajah, we cannot pay you." "I did not ask." "Micajah." "Girl, your grandfather kept me alive. Debts do not rot. Argue with me about this one more time and I will be offended, and you do not want to see a one-armed old miner offended." She did not argue. She almost hugged him. She almost cried. She did neither. She said instead, so quietly the wind almost took it, "Thank you." He tipped his hat with 2 fingers of his good hand and walked back down the bluff without another word. They filed the deed that afternoon at the little land office wedged between the saloon and the barber's chair. Mayor Cornelius Ashby, who was also the county land commissioner, because Stoneford Bend could not afford separate salaries for separate offices, was 58 years old and slightly vain and not quite unkind and not quite kind, the exact species of man who becomes mayor of small towns because the work does not require an opinion, and he had never quite had any strong ones. He read the deed. He read it again. He looked at Hollis, then at Sable, then at Hollis. This land is worthless. I know. There is a large hole in the middle of it. I know. You cannot plow it. I know. You mean to live in a cave. I mean to live in a cabin, Mr. Mayor, inside the cave, with glass windows. He blinked twice. That is the most foolish thing I have heard this year. Then it is a good thing you do not have to live in it. He signed. He slid it across. His voice went softer than she had expected. Miss Thornhill, if you need help, come find me. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. She and Sable stepped out onto the boardwalk into the flat Kansas sunlight, and the whole of Stoneford Bend was waiting for them. 15 people at least ranged along the porch of the general store across the street. None of them speaking, none of them moving, a stillness. So total the only sound in the whole street was a horsefly, working the flank of a bay tied to the hitch rail. At the front of that little crowd, mounted on a black gelding with a silver button coat and a face that had never learned to soften, sat a man Hollis had never seen before and recognized on sight. 68 years old, silver hair pulled back at the nape. 7,000 acres of the best grazing land south of the county line to his name. 200 head of cattle in his brand. $11,000 in a bank in Topeka. A house with 16 rooms in which he lived that season entirely alone. His name, though she did not yet know it, was Barnaby Whitlock, and every silver button on his coat had been ordered from a catalog in St. Louis, and every one had been sewn on by a wife who had not slept in her own bed with her husband for 6 weeks. His voice was not loud. It carried anyway. You will be gone by August. Hollis lifted her chin, not defiant, not afraid, level. Sir, Philadelphia girls, fever girls, grave girls, there is sickness in the seams of your coats. You are what took my niece last month. You are what I mean to run out of this town before it happens again. She heard Sable draw a small, sharp breath at her elbow and did not turn to steady her because turning would have looked like flinching. We buried nobody, sir. We only came to bury a grandmother we never got to meet, and we were 3 months too late even for that. Mercy Kettleworth was not your grandmother's name to be spoken by strangers. Then I will speak it as her granddaughter, which I am, to whom she wrote for 12 years, who does not intend to leave. Something passed across Barnaby Whitlock's face that Hollis would not understand for another 6 months. Not rage, not exactly. Something older than rage, something that had been living behind that face so long it had made its own furniture in there. His jaw tightened once. His gloved hands shifted on the rein. You will. We will not. Suit yourself, girl. He wheeled the black gelding. He rode away at a walk unhurried the way a man rides who has never in his life had to hurry for anyone. The crowd on the porch watched him go. Then one at a time, without a nod or a word among them, turned and went back inside the store, as if a bell they alone could hear had rung. Sable's whisper crawled up Hollis's sleeve. Sister, he hates us. He does not know us. He hates us, Hollis. Hollis took her sister's hand. Her voice went quieter, not softer, quieter, which was a different thing. Sable, listen, a man like that is not hating us. He is hating something we look like, something we remind him of. The day we start hating him back is the day he wins. Do you understand? No, neither do I, but I am the older one. I get to pretend. Sable laughed, a small, sudden, broken laugh, the first laugh she had made since a Philadelphia Depot bench, and Hollis kept her hand and walked them both back toward the Reverend's kitchen without turning around once to see if the crowd had come back out. That afternoon, Micajah Redfern hauled the first wagon load of ponderosa pine up the wagon track to the base of the bluff, whistle in the traces, breathing his one raspy note. By evening, 4 beams lay stacked in the outer chamber of the cave beside a small canvas tent where Micajah meant to sleep until the cabin was closed in. Reverend Pettigrew came up on foot with a covered basket at his elbow. Along with a small hand-drawn plan of a smokehouse, he thought they might want to add along the west wall later once the money allowed. He was 72 years old. Every step looked like a small negotiation with the next one. He would not accept payment for his supper contribution, and he would not stay to eat any of it. He said only before he turned back down the trail, "Girls, whatever they say in town this summer, remember, there is one person in every town who does not go along. Find that person. Keep them close. Your grandmother told me that once. I did not understand it until the year I turned 50. Sable read that same sentence to Hollis 2 nights later out of the 5th letter in the canvas pouch without knowing the Reverend had ever spoken it. She read it lying on her side by the little tent lantern, the letter tilted toward the flame, her voice small and precise. There is always one person in every town who does not go along. Find that person. Keep them close. That is how you survive." She looked up at her sister. Grandmother knew a lot. She lived a long time alone, so she paid attention. Yes, they banked the lantern. They slept on straw ticks on the limestone floor of the outer chamber, with a canvas draped between them and the cave mouth for the illusion of a wall, and for the first time in 9 months, Sable's cough did not wake her at 3 in the morning, because the air on that limestone floor was 55 degrees, and neither too dry nor too damp, and her small ribs had, without her noticing, begun the slow work of remembering how to expand without pain. The building began the next morning and did not stop for 6 months and 11 days. They followed the diagram, 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, set 20 feet back from the mouth of the cave on a floor. Makaja leveled with a poured mixture of crushed limestone and river sand, hauled up by whistle one barrelful at a time. Double plank walls with a 4-inch cavity between them, and into that cavity, packed hard by Sable's small hands, because Sable's hands were the only hands narrow enough to reach, went sheared wool, bought at cost from a farmer named Amos Fairbrook, who lived 9 miles west and had come out of Kentucky with a limp from Shiloh, and a wife who had not lived to see the Kansas grass go green. He sold them the wool at a price so low, Hollis assumed she had misheard him and asked twice. He sold them 2 milk goats named Buttermilk and Junebug, at a price that was not a price at all, more like a favor pressed into her palm. He would not take extra when she tried. His voice came slow, the Kentucky in it worn smooth. "Miss Thornhill, my mother lived in a root cellar under our barn for the whole winter of '63 when the raiders came through and burned the house. She kept us alive that way. I do not laugh at your house. I do not laugh at any house that means to keep a child warm through a Kansas January. You come find me if you need anything at all. I do not care what those people in that town say. They are wrong about a great many things, and this is only the newest of them." Hollis walked back to the bluff with 2 goats on a lead rope and a cart of wool behind her, and she did not stop smiling the whole 3 miles, because it was the first time since Philadelphia that a stranger had been kind to her without being asked. She told Sable about him that night by the lantern in the tent. Sable listened, nodded, and said only without looking up from her mending, "There is one in every town." The town watched. It pretended not to, because pretending is a Kansas specialty, but every Sunday afternoon through May and June, wagon after wagon rattled out of Stoneford Bend along the wagon track at the base of the bluff. The wagons stopped, the families climbed down with picnic baskets. The children pointed, the men shook their heads with the slow, satisfied disgust of people watching a fool prove them right. Sable named them the audience the first Sunday. Makaja named them vultures under his breath the second, and did not use the word again because he saw the way it landed on Sable's face. Barnaby Whitlock was there every Sunday, always at the front, always on the black gelding, never dismounting, never smiling, never scowling, only watching the way a wolf watches a thorn that has not yet learned to walk. Hollis waved to him every Sunday. Every single one. He never waved back. She waved anyway. Sable asked her, the 4th Sunday axe in her hand as she came in from the woodpile, "Why do you do that?" Hollis's answer was quick and not entirely honest. "Because it cost me nothing." But Sable had watched her sister's hand as it came down from the wave. Sable had seen the tremor in Hollis's fingers, small no more than a candle flame in a still room, but present and present every Sunday. And Sable did not say anything about it. She only started waving too from beside the woodpile, axe in one hand, the other lifted, so that if her sister was going to keep making a public gift of civility to a man who had promised to run them out of town by August, at least she would not be doing it alone. It became over the weeks a small ritual neither of them named, and the audience noticed and did not know what to do with it. Barnaby Whitlock noticed and knew exactly what to do with it, which was nothing in public and everything in the small hours of his own house, where he was not sleeping. By the 16th of June, the walls were up. By the 10th of July, the roof was on split shingles laid over pine, sheathing over hand-hewn rafters, all of it slanting slightly toward the natural fissure in the ceiling, so that no matter what fell from the Kansas sky, the water would find its own way home. Makaja climbed the outside of the bluff that same afternoon with a rope around his waist and one good arm, and capped the fissure with a fieldstone chimney he had dry-laid, then mortared with the last of a bag of lime the Reverend had pressed on him at a discount that was not a discount. He was 63 years old. Hollis stood at the base of the bluff and did not breathe once for the 40 minutes he was up there. When he came down, she hugged him, and he froze the way a man freezes who has not been hugged in 19 years. Then he patted her once between the shoulder blades with the flat of his good hand, and he said into the top of her head, so gruff it almost was not words, "That will do, girl, that will do." That night the three of them ate their first supper inside the cabin, though the door was not yet hung, and a canvas was strung across the opening in its place. Cornbread. Beans cooked with a stub of salt pork. A single onion Sable had coaxed out of a wooden crate of prairie soil in the outer chamber, where a slant of morning light reached in. Water from a small spring at the back of the cave that Elias Kettleworth had noted in his careful blue pencil 20 years before, as running steady at 44 degrees regardless of season. Fresh milk from Buttermilk, who did not seem to mind being milked in a stall carved out of the third cave chamber. Hollis watched her sister eat, thinking for the first time in her life that there was a version of the world in which the two of them would be all right. Not safe, not yet, but all right. It was a distinction she had not known she needed. She held on to it with both hands. The oak door went on the 4th of August, 3 inches thick, iron-hinged, cut from a tree. Amos Fairbrook had donated out of his own back woodlot without asking anything in return, except that she come by on a Sunday sometime and take a piece of pie with him and tell him about the cabin so he could tell his wife about it in his prayers that night. The door had a bar of oak that dropped into iron brackets on the inside. When Hollis dropped it in the first time, the sound of the wood against the iron went through the outer chamber like a slow, low note struck on a bell, and Sable turned and looked at her, and her face did something Hollis had not seen since Philadelphia. Not quite a smile, something older than a smile. "Sister, it closes. It closes. Nobody can open it from outside. Nobody." Sable nodded once, went back to sweeping the cabin floor. Did not speak of it again, but Hollis noticed that her sister slept. That first night behind the closed door, with her small hand uncurled on the coverlet, instead of tucked into a fist beneath her chin, and it was the first time in the whole of Hollis's memory that she had ever seen the child sleep with her fingers loose. On the 3rd of July, before the door was hung, before the roof was fully on, before either of the sisters knew a boy named Rufus Talley existed, someone had come up the bluff in the middle of the night and set fire to the woodpile they had spent 6 weeks building against the west wall of the outer chamber. Sable saw it first. She had risen to use the small privy Makaja had dug behind a screen of scrub cedar, and through the cave mouth she had seen the orange glow, and she had run, because that is what you do when something you built with your own hands is on fire. She ran barefoot across limestone, still holding the last of the day's heat. She got there just as a burning log rolled clear of the pile and came to rest against the dry brush at the edge of the bluff, and she reached down without thinking, and she picked it up with her bare left hand, and she threw it clear into the empty air over the drop. Her left palm cooked from the base of the thumb to the tip of the little finger. She did not scream. She sat down in the dirt beside the last of the burning pile with her hand held out in front of her as if it belonged to somebody else, and she was waiting for that person to come and claim it. Hollis found her that way. Not crying, not screaming, just sitting, staring at her own hand, the orange light of the last logs painting her small, still face in colors that did not belong to any child in any world Hollis had ever agreed to live in. Sable. I stopped it, Hollis. Sable, let me look. If it had caught the grass, it would have taken the whole bluff, the cave, everything. Sweetheart. I stopped it. Hollis sat down in the dirt beside her sister, then pulled the girl into her arms without touching the ruined hand, and held her and Sable at last finally. At last began to shake. Above them, on the wagon track a mile away, a rider Hollis could not yet name touched his heels to a black gelding and rode home in the dark to a 16-room house where the lamps burned late in a parlor, and a woman in a black shawl sat on a sofa reading one careful page at a time, a diary. A dead friend had left her. Dr. Obadiah Winslow rode up the bluff at first light on the 4th of July, 68 years old, thin as a fence post, the only man in Stoneford Bend who still remembered which end of a Hippocratic oath to hold on to. Makaja had ridden into town before dawn and dragged the doctor back by the collar of his nightshirt without a word of explanation, because the words would have taken time. Neither of them had. Sable was sitting upright on the pine table in the half-finished cabin when Winslow came through the canvas where the door would soon hang, her left hand cradled in a folded cloth soaked with cold spring water, her face the color of tallow. The doctor did not speak at first. He set his black bag on the pine boards. He lifted the cloth. He looked. His breath went out slow through his nose. His voice, when it came, was not the voice of a country doctor. It was the voice of a man who had once been young at Antietam, who had learned what a hand looked like when a hand had been asked to do more than a hand was made for. "Miss Thornhill, this will hurt her worse than the burn did. Hold her shoulders. Do not let her pull the arm away, no matter what sound she makes." He washed the palm with lye soap thinned in cold water, and Sable did not make a sound. And Hollis was later not sure which of the two of them that was harder on. He spread honey across the raw skin from the base of the thumb to the tip of the little finger. He bound it in linen strips he tore from a shirt he had brought for the purpose. He gave her a small tin cup of whiskey and told her to drink it. She made a face. She drank it. He nodded once, satisfied, the way a man nods when a young animal has done a hard thing without being asked twice. He asked Hollis to walk with him a short way down the trail out of earshot of the cabin. They stopped at the second bend where the wagon track dipped and a stand of scrub cedar screened them from the cave mouth. His voice went low. "Miss Thornhill. Yes, I know who did this. So do I. I am not going to tell the sheriff. The sheriff is his cousin. Then you understand." "I understand." He looked at his boots for a long moment, at the mud caked on the welts, at nothing. "There is one thing more you should know before I ride back down. It is not mine to tell. I am telling it anyway because I am too old to be careful and too tired to be kind." Hollis waited. She had learned in 6 months of learning that a Kansas man who takes off his hat before he speaks is a man about to hand you something heavy. Barnaby Whitlock has not slept in his own bed for 6 weeks. He sleeps on the parlor sofa. His wife Iphigenia told me last month she was afraid for him. She asked me if there was anything to be done. The doctor's mouth twisted. "There is not, and I told her so, and she thanked me for my honesty as if I had given her something." "Miss Thornhill, your grandmother kept a diary." "Not the letters. A private book. She left it to Iphigenia Whitlock. I do not know why." The two women had been friends a long time ago, before Barnaby made friendship inconvenient. Iphigenia has been reading the diary slowly, 1 page a night. 6 weeks ago, she read a page aloud to Barnaby. She will not tell me which page. He has not slept in his own bed since. Hollis's fingers had gone very still against the seam of her apron. "Doctor." "Yes." "Why are you telling me?" "Because the man who tried to burn your woodpile last night is not the man he was 6 weeks ago. Something is happening to him. Something ugly and slow and holy. When it finishes with him, I want you to be ready." He tipped his hat. He walked back to his mule. He rode down the bluff at a walk, one shoulder held higher than the other from an old injury he had never explained. And Hollis stood alone on the trail for a full minute before her legs remembered how to carry her back up. She did not tell Sable what the doctor had said. She could not think of a shape to put the words in that would not frighten the child. She went inside and sat beside her sister on the pine table and picked up the Bible from the shelf and turned to the last blank page. After Revelation, the page. Mercy Kettleworth had ruled with a small pencil grid and headed in her spidery hand a diary of prayers for the girls who will come. 12 years of daily entries. Hollis had not yet let herself read them straight through. She read now. She read the entry for August 14th of 1882. "Lord, my friend Iphigenia lost her only child this morning. Delphine died in a boarding house in Topeka of consumption. She was 34. She has left a small son. She has left a father who has burned every letter she ever sent home. Lord, have mercy on Barnaby. His pain will eat him if you do not hold him. I forgive him what he did to me long ago. I ask you to forgive him too. His heart is not stone. His heart is a wound that never closed. Send him a girl someday. Send him someone. Send him away home. Amen." Hollis closed the Bible. She sat with her hand flat on the black leather cover for a long time. She did not weep. She did not know yet what to do with the arithmetic of a dead woman praying in 1882, that a girl would someday be sent to a man who would try to burn that dead woman's granddaughters out of their cave 5 years later. She only knew that the arithmetic had somewhere between the first word of the prayer and the last been quietly assigned to her, and that refusing it was a door she was not going to open. Behind her, Sable murmured something soft in whiskey, sleep her bandaged hand loose against her collarbone. Hollis rose. She walked out to the cave mouth. She stood in the noon sun with the Bible against her ribs, and she said out loud to a woman who had prayed for her every night for 12 years, "Grandmother, fine, I hear you. Reverend Ambrose Pettigrew came up the bluff 7 days later on foot alone, in his black wool coat that must have been suffocating him in the July heat, carrying a covered dish balanced on his forearm the way a man carries a chalice. Hollis met him at the trailhead because his knees would not have taken the last 100 paces. She took the dish, she uncovered it. Peach cobbler still warmed the crust, the color of an old copper coin. His voice came slow between breaths that had not yet caught. "My wife's recipe. She has been gone 11 years. It took me 3 tries this week. May I sit?" He sat on the flat rock outside the cave mouth. Sable came out. Makaja drifted over from the woodshop lean-to he was framing, and then, because it did not seem right to sit while a reverend sat, stood off to one side and stayed standing. The reverend held his hat between his knees. His pale eyes went to the mouth of the cave, to the smoke curling from the fieldstone chimney above the fissure, to the 2 goats tethered in the shade of a juniper, and something in his face settled. "Your grandmother was the finest woman I have ever known in 72 years of ministry, and I have known a great many. She sat in the 3rd pew left side every Sunday for 41 years, even the Sunday after your grandfather went into the ground. Black dress, empty seat beside her, singing louder than anyone in the room." He paused. His thumb worked at the brim of the hat. "In the dry years of 73, when half this county lost everything she had, almost nothing herself, she took whatever she had and gave it to the church for orphan children in Topeka. Every month, $1, sometimes 2, sometimes a jar of chow-chow, sometimes only a note in her hand that said, 'Forgive me, this is all I can spare.' There is a home in Topeka that has raised 43 orphans over 22 years. Every one of those children owes their bread to your grandmother, and not one of them ever knew her name." Sable's fingers had crept up to grip her sister's sleeve. "Girls, there is one thing more, and it is not mine to tell, but at my age some secrets are worse for the keeping. This one you are going to need." He drew a long breath. He seemed to gather it from somewhere deeper than his lungs. 45 years ago, when your grandmother was 20 and Barnaby Whitlock was 23, he asked her to marry him. She refused him. She chose your grandfather instead. Elias was poor. He worked with rocks. He had no land, no father to lean on. Nothing but a blue pencil and a good ear for barometric pressure. Barnaby had 100 acres already, and the father who owned more. She chose Elias. Barnaby has not forgiven the choice. Not in 45 years. Hollis's voice came out flat. "He hates a dead woman." The Reverend closed his eyes. "He hates a decision. That is a different thing, but from the outside it looks the same." Makaja, who had said nothing until now, spoke once from the shadow of the juniper low gravel. "It is not the same, it is worse." The Reverend did not disagree. "There is more, Miss Thornhill. 22 years ago, Barnaby's daughter Delphine, 18 years old and only child, fell in love with a young man from the flour mill on the Neo show. Poor, kind, steady. Barnaby forbade the match in front of the whole town from the porch of his own store. He said from that porch that Delphine was no longer his daughter. He said it in the hearing of the pastor before me. She ran. She lived 14 years in a boarding house in Topeka, doing piecework by lamplight. She wrote her father every Christmas Eve. He returned every letter unopened. 14 envelopes. 14 Christmases. She died of consumption in 82, as I imagine you already know now that you have opened your grandmother's diary." Hollis nodded once. She had not told him she had opened it. He had known she would. "She left a boy. His name is Ozias, 6 years old this coming August. The one you see on the little pinto pony in town on Saturday mornings, holding on to his grandfather's coat with 2 fists. Barnaby took him in the week the boarding house sent word. He has raised the child himself. He has never spoken his daughter's name aloud in Ozias's hearing, not once in 6 years. Your grandmother wrote him 3 letters after Delphine's death. She asked to be allowed to visit the boy, only to sit, only to bring him a plate of gingerbread, only to read him a chapter of a book. He burned all 3. He burned the last one in front of me in his own kitchen while I stood in the doorway with my hat in my hand. He said when it was ashes that he was sorry to have wasted my time. He then walked me to my horse. A long silence. Reverend Pettigrew's hands were shaking on the brim of his hat, and he was not trying to hide it. Hollis's voice came out quieter than she meant. Reverend, why are you telling us all of this now? He lifted his face to hers. His pale eyes were red at the rims. Because a man who has been burning things for 22 years is going to burn something bigger one day. When he does, I want at least one person in this county to know why, so that someone can love him afterward, because I am no longer sure he will be able to love himself. He set the empty cobbler dish on the flat rock. He stood slow, one hand on his knee. His knees creaked audibly, the sound of 2 dry hinges. Thank you for the sitting. He walked home. Hollis watched him until his black coat disappeared around the 3rd bend of the trail, and she did not move for a long time after he was gone. Sable's small voice broke the quiet. Sister. Yes. Which of them did you feel sorry for just now? Hollis looked down at her sister. Both of them. Sable nodded, satisfied with an answer that would have troubled a smaller heart, and went back inside to finish the mending. They rebuilt the woodpile through the last 2 weeks of July and the first 3 of August, this time inside the cave. In the outer chamber along both limestone walls stacked 8 feet high and running 40 feet back toward the inner door. No man's match could reach it there. Makaja did the splitting because his one good arm had learned to compensate the way certain trees learn to grow around a rock. Hollis did the stacking, and Sable, whose left hand had begun to knit into a shiny pink map of an event she would carry the rest of her life, counted logs and kept the tally in her grandfather's blank arithmetic notebook. By the 15th of August, the pile was twice what it had been before the fire. Makaja looked at it one evening in the slanting orange light of the cave mouth and passed his good hand along a course of split oak. Girls, you could heat the state of Kansas with this. Sable, who had not smiled in a way that meant it since April smiled. It was small. It was hers. Amos Fairbrook came up the wagon track on the 12th of September, driving a farm cart with 3 sacks in the bed and a wife beside him on the bench, whose name was Louisa, and whose hands were folded quiet against a plain gray traveling apron. Hollis had not known Amos had brought his wife. He had said only that he wanted to bring by something for winter. What he brought were 3 sacks of seed potatoes, 2 burlap bundles of dried apples he had put up himself, and a small folded quilt in a pattern of interlocking stars that Louisa Fairbrook set into Sable's arms without saying a word about the burn scars along the girl's left palm. Louisa's voice came slow, careful, the Kentucky in it thinner than her husband's, but present. Child, I lost a daughter your age to the fever the year we came out here. I have been keeping this quilt in a cedar chest for 11 years for a girl who never came home to it. I would rather it warmed a girl who came than lie folded another winter for one who cannot. Sable held the quilt against her cheek, and she did not cry because she had learned from Hollis how not to, but her small shoulders went uneven for one long breath and then evened out again. Louisa Fairbrook reached across and touched the top of Sable's head. Once. Very light. Then she climbed back onto the cart bench and did not look back down the trail as Amos turned the mule. Word of that visit reached Stoneford Bend inside of a week because word in a Kansas town of 150 souls travels at exactly the speed of one indignant wife telling one skeptical husband over supper. By the last Sunday in September, only 9 wagons came out to sit at the base of the bluff. The Sunday after that, 6. The Sunday after that, 4. And one of them was a family from a farm 11 miles west whose oldest boy had been born blue and had lived because a school teacher named Verity Lockridge had taught his mother how to warm him against her own bare chest. And that family had come not to gawk, but to sit in the grass without a picnic basket and simply look at the smoke curling from the fieldstone chimney as if the smoke were a kind of answer. Hollis did not wave that Sunday. She only stood at the cave mouth with her hand at her side. The mother lifted a hand back, and Hollis felt something small and hard behind her sternum turn over once, and she went back inside to help Sable with the supper. Barnaby Whitlock did not come to any of those Sundays after the 8th of September. His black gelding stood in its paddock. His wife's shawl no longer moved behind the parlor curtains at the front of his house on Main. Iphigenia Whitlock had, according to what the Reverend told Hollis in a low aside on the porch of the church one Saturday morning, taken to walking the wagon roads north of town in the early evenings with the diary of a dead friend tucked under her arm. Twice, she had been seen sitting on a flat stone at the base of the bluff, not close enough to be greeted, not far enough to be politely ignored, reading a page, closing the book, walking home. The Reverend's mouth had gone tight when he told Hollis this. The woman is drowning in her own parlor. I do not know what to do for her. I do not know what her husband is doing to her that she chooses to walk instead of sit at her own hearth. I am afraid to guess. Hollis had said nothing. Later that afternoon, she had walked down to the flat stone at the base of the bluff and left on it, weighted with a small chip of limestone, a folded square of paper on which she had written in her most careful hand, "If it ever gets bad enough, the oak door will open for you. It is not a favor. It is a promise." She did not sign it. She walked back up the bluff without looking behind her. When she passed the stone the next morning, the paper was gone. The frost came early that year. On the 7th of October, a thin skin of ice sealed the water trough behind the church overnight, and by the 11th, the last of the goldenrod along the wagon track had gone brown at the edges. Hollis and Sable moved Buttermilk and Junebug from the tethered stall in the outer chamber to a proper stall Micajah had framed at the back of the third chamber, where the limestone walls held 60 degrees no matter what the sky above the bluff was doing. Micajah brought Whistle up to a fourth stall he had cut into the same corridor because his own cabin's chimney had cracked in the summer heat, and he had not had time to relay the flue before winter. Also, though he did not say this because he had decided sometime in September that he was not going to spend another Kansas winter alone in a two-room shanty a mile out of town when there was a warm cave 3 miles further and 2 sisters in it who did not deserve to sleep unprotected. Hollis did not argue. She only helped him move his trunk. Sable made him a small rag rug for the doorway of the stall room, where he had chosen to sling his bedroll. The first snow came on the 3rd of November. A dusting only, but the wind that pushed it had teeth. In Stoneford Bend, chimneys smoked hard. Children were pulled indoors. Zebediah Marston, the town builder, whose youngest son Theodore was 7 that year, sent his pregnant wife Ada to bed at 3 in the afternoon with a hot brick wrapped in flannel because the cold had gone into her hips in a way that frightened him. Up on the bluff, Hollis put one small log of split oak into the stove at 7 in the morning. By noon, the cabin was 72 degrees. Sable took off her wool shawl and folded it across the back of the pine rocker Micajah had built out of scraps and had not yet finished sanding. She sat down in it. She opened the leather notebook to the chapter titled On the Reading of Sky. She began to read it aloud, one paragraph at a time in her clear, precise voice, and Hollis, mending a sock across the pine table, listened. Did not know yet what she was listening to. Did not know yet that her sister had begun that morning without telling anyone. The slow, patient work of memorizing the whole chapter word for word. Elias Kettleworth had written the chapter in the last winter of his life, 1867, in a small room off a Topeka boarding house, where he had gone alone to finish the notebook because Mercy had been too heavy with grief already to bear watching him fail. 43 pages, 15 years of Kansas weather compressed into ink, so careful the letters were smaller than a grain of rice in places. He had written it, the preface said, for the granddaughters he did not expect to meet. He had ended the preface with a single sentence. Sable read aloud on the afternoon of the 3rd of November, while her sister mended a sock and the first light snow drifted past the cave mouth. The sky will tell you what it means to do to you if you have learned to listen. And the price of not listening in this country is not a wet coat, but a small grave. Sable set the notebook down. She sat with her hands flat against the closed leather cover for a long time. Hollis, who had heard the sentence and understood only that it had landed somewhere important in the child, did not press her. She only tied off the thread and picked up the next sock. Sable that afternoon walked out to the cave mouth, stood there for a while looking east across the prairie, came back in and asked Micajah without preamble if he would help her mount the small brass barometer that had come in the same crate as the stove and that Hollis had set aside on a shelf because there had not seemed to be a good place for it. Micajah mounted it that evening on the wall beside the oak door at a height Sable could reach without a step. He drove the nail one-handed. He was learning to do things one-handed the way a musician learns a new key. Sable began that same night to read the barometer at 7 in the morning at noon. At 7 in the evening before bed to write the reading in the back of the leather notebook in her own hand in a small, careful column that would run before winter was out to more than 300 entries. On the last day of November, Zebediah Marston's boy, Theodore came home from the schoolhouse with his face flushed and his eyes glassy, and by supper, he was burning up. Verity Lockridge, 41 years old that year, the town school teacher who kept her hair in a knot so tight it pulled at her temples, and whose classroom had been the site 7 months earlier of the small speech that had ended with Sable Thornhill being told to gather her books and not return, walked from house to house that evening in the cold, checking on every child in her 28-pupil roster. She did it because it was what her mother had done when Verity was small in Ohio, because she had lost, though she never spoke of it, a younger brother to scarlet fever in 1859 at the age of 5, because a schoolmistress who did not walk her town when the first fever hit was, in Verity Lockridge's private estimation, no schoolmistress at all. Theodore Marston recovered inside of 4 days. 2 other children in her class did not. By the 10th of December, Prudence Marston, aged 9, and Nathaniel Boone, aged 11, were in the little cemetery behind the church under fresh dirt. The Reverend had turned himself because the town gravedigger had gone to his brother's farm for the winter, and there had been no one else to ask. Verity Lockridge, standing at the smaller of the 2 graves in a black wool coat and a hat with a black ribbon. She had sewn on herself the night before, closed her eyes during the Reverend's committal, and did not open them until she felt a hand slide into hers. She looked down. It was Adelaide Talley, whose 14-year-old boy Rufus was standing 3 steps behind his mother in a coat too thin for the weather, and whose whole body had gone still under the Reverend's voice, the way a rabbit goes still when the hawk's shadow crosses. Adelaide's grip on Verity's hand was so hard Verity's knuckles ached. Adelaide's whisper came through her teeth, "Do not tell me it is in God's hands. Do not." Verity did not tell her. Verity Lockridge, in that moment, made a decision she did not yet have words for, which was that she was going to spend the rest of that winter revisiting one careful evening at a time every opinion she had voiced in the last 5 years about who in this town deserved a warm room and who did not. She started that same night by writing in a small book she kept in her top bureau drawer the words, "I was wrong about the Thornhill girls. I do not yet know how wrong. I mean to find out." She did not tell anyone what she had written. She did not need to. The next morning she walked past the general store on her way to the schoolhouse, and Josiah Kellerman, standing on the porch with his pipe unlit in his teeth, said something loud enough for her to hear about the 2 girls up on the bluff eating goat cheese in a hole in the ground, while decent children were being buried, and Verity Lockridge, who had never in her life spoken a sharp word to a man on Main Street, turned on the boardwalk and looked at him and said in a voice so level it did not carry beyond the porch, "Josiah, Prudence Marston did not die of goat cheese. She died of fever the town of Stoneford Bend has been carrying since October. You were not to my knowledge at either graveside yesterday. Do not speak to me about decency until you have stood in the cold beside a mother whose child you have never once asked after." She walked on. Josiah Kellerman took the pipe out of his teeth and did not put it back. Behind him, through the open door of the store, the town heard. By the 22nd of December, the fever had claimed a 4th. An old widow named Ephrata Boone, whose husband had homesteaded the section south of the creek in 71, and who had lived alone in the sod and plank house since he had gone in 84. She was found by a neighbor bringing a Christmas basket. She had been dead 2 days. The Reverend, walking home from her funeral through a wet snow that had begun to turn to sleet as the sun went down, arrived at his kitchen door to find a folded square of paper wedged between the door and the frame. He read it inside by the light of a single lamp. It was in Hollis Thornhill's careful hand. "Reverend, whatever you need, whatever we can give, tell us." He set the paper down on the pine table. He sat down beside it. He put his face in his hands. He wept for a long time, and none of it was for himself. Christmas Eve on the bluff was quiet. Sable read the story of the shepherds aloud from Mercy Kettleworth's Bible, with her small, scarred hand curled around the top edge of the black leather because the hand was still tender and cold and gripping warmed it. Micajah listened with his eyes closed, sitting in a straight-back chair beside the stove, with a mug of hot milk laced with a spoon of Amos Fairbrook's applejack he had been saving. Hollis sat at the pine table with a pencil and a piece of butcher paper and drew from memory of 6 months of watching a rough map of Stoneford Bend. Every house on it, every barn, every lean-to and stable and shed. She marked the shortest route from each dwelling to the base of the bluff. She marked the wagon roads. She marked in a small, careful notation her grandfather would have recognized the places where a person moving in a whiteout would have a fence line to follow, and the places where a person would have to cross open ground with no rope. She did not tell Sable or Makaja what she was drawing. She folded the map when it was done and put it in the leather notebook beside the On the Reading of Sky chapter. She had been drawing it in fits and starts since the second week of November when the fever had first begun to move through town. She had not spoken of it because she had not yet decided when the copies would be delivered. She banked the stove. She went to bed. Somewhere in Topeka, a woman she had never met was at that same hour taking down a diary from a bureau drawer to read the entry for December 24th of 1882. Somewhere in a 16-room house on the south side of Stoneford Bend, a man was sitting on a parlor sofa with his boots still on, staring at the fire, not sleeping. The 10th of January of 1888 was falsely, brutally warm. 42 degrees at dawn, an unearned spring in the middle of a Kansas winter, the kind of weather that pulls coats off shoulders and shortens tempers and makes children in a schoolhouse ask if they may take their lunches outside. Verity Lockridge said yes because she could not think of a reason to say no. By 11 in the morning, the wagons on Main were rolling with their canvases folded back. By 2 in the afternoon, Adelaide Talley had hung a line of wash on the rope behind her cabin because a woman with a boy that age has always more washing than sky to dry it in, and any sky offered in January is a sky a wise woman uses. Rufus was 14 years old. He carried the basket for her. He did not know that in his coat pocket still were $2 silver he had not yet found the courage to give back and had not yet found the courage to spend. Up on the bluff at 7 in the morning, Sable read the barometer. She read it again at 11. She read it a third time at 1 o'clock, put her thumb against the brass casing, tapped it twice the way her grandfather's notebook had instructed, and looked at the reading again. She walked outside to the cave mouth and stood in the false warm sunlight with her wool shawl loose across her shoulders, and she looked at the western horizon for a long time. She came back inside. She closed the oak door behind her, not fully, only enough to muffle the sound of the wind, though there was no wind. She walked to where her sister was carding wool in the rocker beside the stove. Her voice came flat and small. "Hollis." "Yes." "The barometer. It has fallen 3/10 of an inch since 11. 2 hours." Hollis set the wool down slowly. "Sable. The sky is yellow at the western edge. It was not this morning. The wind has stopped." Hollis looked at her sister. She saw, for the first time since April, the child she had been in Philadelphia, the child who had cried the whole walk to Broad Street Station because a woman had closed a door on them. Under that child, the young woman who had memorized 43 pages of a dead man's weather notes because she had believed there might come a day when memorizing them mattered. Hollis's chest went hollow. "How long, Sable? Grandfather wrote that when the pressure drops that fast and the wind quits and the sky goes yellow at the edges, the killing storm arrives inside of 24 hours, sometimes less. He wrote it comes from the northwest. He wrote it bends the compass. He wrote the temperature will fall 60 degrees in 3 hours. He wrote it several times. He underlined the northwest." Hollis stood. She was already reaching for her coat. "How sure are you?" "Hollis, I am 15. I have been reading his notebook every day for 6 months. If I am wrong, we will have a cold night. If I am right and we do nothing." She stopped. She did not finish. She did not need to. Makaja had come in from the outer chamber during the last exchange with a length of pine still in his one good hand and was standing very still by the stove. His pale eyes moved once between the two sisters. His voice when it came was low and certain. "The child is right. I have felt something wrong in the air since I woke. I did not know what it was. She knows what it is." Hollis was already at the oak door. "I am going into town." Sable's voice cracked once, only once. "Once, Hollis. I have to warn them. They will not listen." Hollis stopped with her hand on the iron bar. She turned. She looked at her sister across the length of the cabin, across 6 months of shared work, across a burned palm and a diary of prayers and a grandfather's careful blue pencil. "Sable, if I do not try, I will spend the rest of my life wondering. That is a longer winter than any Kansas ever made." She kissed the child once on the forehead. She went out. Makaja followed her as far as the cave mouth. His voice came after her low, "Girl, take Whistle. He knows the wagon road in the dark. Your gelding does not." She took Whistle. She left the gelding tied. She rode into Stoneford Bend at 10 o'clock at night. She woke Zebediah Marston first because Marston was the town builder, And if any man in Stoneford Bend would understand a structural warning, it would be Marston. He came to the door in a nightshirt with a lamp in his hand and a look on his face that said he had been asleep for perhaps 40 minutes and had earned every one of them. Miss Thornhill, do you know what hour? A storm is coming, a killing one. You need to bank your chimney. Check your roof beams. Bring the animals into the barn tonight. Do not send Theodore to school in the morning. Marston stared at her. He rubbed one hand across his jaw. A storm. Yes, sir, my sister read the barometer. She read my grandfather's notebook. She has been watching the sky since noon. The little one who reads books. Yes, sir. She read a barometer. A slow, tired disbelief moved across his face like a shadow. Well, that settles it. Somebody wake the governor. Miss Thornhill, go home. He shut the door. She stood on his porch for one long breath. She turned. She rode to the next house. Josiah Kellerman opened 3 inches of the door and closed it again before she had finished the second sentence. She rode to the mayor. Cornelius Ashby, in a dressing gown of gray wool, listened with his hand on the doorframe and his eyes going slowly out of focus with sleep, and said when she was done in a voice not unkind, Miss Thornhill, I will keep it in mind, which meant nothing at all. She rode to the schoolhouse to warn Verity Lockridge and found the schoolhouse dark and the schoolmistress not home. She rode to the boarding house where Verity kept her room and knocked. She was told the schoolmistress had gone to sit up with the widow Tally, whose boy Rufus had come home from an errand at Whitlock's ranch that afternoon with a face gone gray in a way Adelaide had not liked and had made him lie down. Hollis rode to the Tally cabin. She knocked. Adelaide came to the door with a wet cloth in her hand. Verity was behind her, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair coming loose from its knot for perhaps the first time in a decade. Hollis, for the first time all night, did not have to fight to be heard. Adelaide's face went pale as Hollis spoke. Verity's went pale in a different way. Adelaide's whisper cut across the second sentence. My boy cannot travel tonight. He is burning up. I cannot get him 3 miles up a bluff in a wagon in this weather. Hollis said without hesitation. Then keep him warm. Bank the fire high. If the storm comes down as hard as I fear, do not open the door for anyone but me or my sister. If it lets up in the morning, come to us. We will send Makaja down with a sled. Adelaide's fingers closed hard on the doorframe. Verity's voice came low behind her level as a set square. Miss Thornhill, where else have you been tonight? Everywhere. Nobody has listened. Verity's mouth went tight. I will go from here to every house you have not yet reached. They will listen to me because I have taught their children. Ride home. Your sister needs you more than this town does. Hollis did not ride home. Not yet. She rode from the Tally cabin to the wagon road that circled the outside of town, and she stopped Whistle in the middle of it, under a moon that had gone strangely bright behind a thin, high veil of ice cirrus that had not been there at dusk. She sat on the mule in the cold, empty road, and she thought about the letter her grandmother had written her, the one about no child in this county being as alone as she had been. She thought about Iphigenia Whitlock walking the wagon roads north of town with a diary of a dead friend under her arm. She thought about a paragraph the Reverend had spoken on a flat rock outside her cave mouth about a man burning things for 22 years. She thought about the $2 Rufus Tally was still carrying in his coat, about a boy on a pinto pony who did not know his mother's name. She thought about a paragraph in her grandfather's hand that had ended with a small grave. She turned Whistle around. She rode back into Stoneford Bend. She rode to every house she had already knocked on, to every house she had not, and at every gate and every door frame and every mailbox, she slid folded twice and tucked to keep the wind from taking it. The small hand-drawn map she had been carrying inside the leather notebook since Christmas Eve, copied out that afternoon in Sable's careful duplicate hand on 20 separate scraps of butcher paper, because Sable had understood even before Hollis had said so, what the maps were for. She rode to houses where the lamps were already out and slid the maps beneath the front doors so quietly no dog barked. She rode to houses where the men had told her to go home and slid the maps under those doors too, because Sable would need to be told someday that her sister had not decided who was worth saving on the basis of who had listened. She rode down the length of Main Street with the moonlight bright on her back and the ice cirrus thickening westward. And at the very last of the houses on the south end, where the wrought iron gate stood shut and the 16 windows were mostly dark, except for one lamp burning steady. In a parlor she had never entered, she dismounted. She walked to the gate. She slid a map through the bars of the gate and let the wind lift it once and set it flat on the frozen ground where a man coming out at dawn would see it. She did not knock. She turned whistle and rode home. Inside the parlor, Iphigenia Whitlock was still awake. She had been awake most nights that winter. She was sitting in the tapestried chair beside the hearth, with the diary open in her lap, reading again the entry from November of 1886. Sable, whose eyes I have never seen. Hollis, whose voice I have never heard. Grant them safe roads to travel. Grant them a house that keeps out cold. Grant them a friend in the town who does not go along. She was reading it for the 11th time when she heard the small sound of paper against the flagstones by the front gate. She did not go to the window. She only closed the diary. She rose. She walked slowly down the front hall. She opened the front door. She walked out into the cold in her house slippers. She stooped, careful, one hand at her waist. She picked up the paper. She read it standing there on the flagstones with her breath rising white and her fingers going numb. She folded it once. She held it against her sternum. She looked up at the western horizon where the moon was going strange behind the ice cirrus, and she said out loud to a woman she had loved 40 years before and quarreled with and lost, and only in the last 3 months begun to love again through the pages of a book, "Mercy, oh mercy, here they come." She walked back inside. She woke her husband on the parlor sofa where he had fallen at last into a shallow sleep. She held the folded map in front of him. Her voice, which had gone quiet in her own house for 6 weeks, came out level and low and did not shake. "Barnaby, read this. Then get out of that coat and put on the wool one. Then go to the barn and bring in every horse. The Thornhill girl has ridden 3 hours through the cold to warn a town that would not warn her. It is now the middle of the night. In the morning, if I am right about what she is telling us, you and I are going to walk out that gate together with Ozias between us, and we are going to walk 3 miles north, and we are going to knock on an oak door in a limestone bluff. And when it opens, you are going to say to her, whatever it is that has been eating you alive for 6 weeks. Do you understand me?" Barnaby Whitlock, 68 years old, cattle baron. Widower Toby, though he did not yet know it, sat up on the parlor sofa with his silver hair loose around his face and read the map his wife was holding, and he did not say anything at all, and Iphigenia Whitlock did not require him to. Hollis rode back up the bluff at 3 in the morning. The false warmth was gone. The air had begun to bite. The moon had lost its edges behind the ice cirrus, which was no longer high and thin, but low and thickening and moving. Sable was awake, standing at the cave mouth, wrapped in Louisa Fairbrook's star quilt. She did not ask if the town had listened. She knew already from Hollis's face, from the way Whistle came up the trail slower than he had gone down. She held the quilt open. Hollis stepped into it. They stood together at the cave mouth, in a single wool cocoon, the sisters, the way they had stood at Broad Street Station 8 months before. The way they had stood at their mother's graveside 12 years before, the way they were going to stand without knowing it, in the doorway of a school they had not yet built for children they had not yet met. Sable's whisper came against Hollis's collarbone. "You went to every house. Every one. Even the ones that shut the door. Even those. Even the Whitlock gate. The map is under the gate. I do not know if he will read it. It does not matter, Hollis. You did what grandmother would have done. That is enough." Hollis's eyes closed. She held her sister tighter. Behind them in the cabin, Makaja had already been up for an hour, banking coals in the stove and hauling water buckets from the spring into every empty vessel he could find. He had, before Hollis came in, filled every kerosene lamp in the cabin. He had, without being asked, stacked 42 split logs beside the stove in a neat pyramid, because 42 was the number Sable had told him would burn for 6 days at the rate of 1 every 4 hours. He had led Buttermilk and Junebug and Whistle back into their stalls and closed the wooden gate at the end of the third chamber corridor with the sliding oak bar Hollis had cut a groove for in October. He had done all of it without a single instruction, because he had spent 40 years learning weather in his skin and had known, from the moment Sable had said the word barometer at 1 o'clock that afternoon, exactly what kind of night was coming. He came out to the cave mouth now with 2 tin mugs of coffee. He handed one to each sister. He did not speak. He only stood beside them and looked west, where the last of the moon was going out, where the wind, which had been still all night, had at last begun very softly to move. The 3 of them stood there together until the first true gust hit the cave mouth at 4:18 in the morning of the 11th of January, 1888. The gust came out of the northwest exactly as Elias Kettleworth had written in a boarding house in Topeka 21 winters before. It did not scream yet. It only pressed once hard against the limestone lip of the cave mouth, lifted the edge of Louisa Fairbrooks' star quilt, and set it back down. Sable's small voice calm now. Very calm, it has started. Hollis's arm tightened around her sister. Yes. Makaja's gravel came low behind them. Girls, get inside, bar the door, trim the wicks. Whatever is coming is not far behind that gust. They went inside. Hollis dropped the oak bar into its iron brackets with the low bell note that had, on the first hearing, made Sable smile a smile that was hers. In the parlor of the 16-room house at the south end of Main Street, Iphigenia Whitlock was already dressed in her heaviest wool traveling coat, sitting in the tapestried chair beside a stove. She had banked herself, waiting for a dawn that would come, if it came at all, through a wall of white, the like of which no living person in Stoneford Bend had seen. In the small cabin behind the Tally washing line, Rufus Tally had begun to shiver in his sleep, and his mother, who had not left his side, put her palm on his forehead and did not know yet that the fever was the least of what the next 3 days would ask of her. The gust that had pressed once against the limestone lip at 4:18 was the polite knock of a caller who meant to break the door down on the second try. The second try came at 4:36 in the morning from a direction the compass rose in Elias Kettleworth's notebook had marked with a small blue underline 3 times. It did not press. It struck. The whole bluff shook once, the way a large animal shakes water off its back, a shudder that went through the limestone floor of the cabin and up through the pine legs of the table and into the tin cups on the shelf, which rattled once in unison like a small choir clearing its throat. Buttermilk bleated somewhere at the back of the third chamber. Whistle, who had lived through 11 Kansas winters and had opinions about them, put his head down and simply accepted. The lamps did not flicker. The mountain, all of it, stood between the two sisters and what was coming. Down in Stoneford Bend, the same gust took the loose shutter on the church bell tower off its last rusted hinge and sent it spinning across the churchyard. Where it struck a headstone, the Reverend had turned himself 6 weeks before and split neatly in two. It took the wash line behind Adelaide Tally's cabin with 3 sheets still pinned to it and drove the sheets flat against the north wall of Zebediah Marston's barn a quarter mile away, where they stuck like frost-white flags nailed there by a pale invisible hand. It took the hat off the night watchman at the livery stable, who had been sent to check the horses and who did not manage to shut the barn door behind him before the wind did it for him, slamming it so hard the top hinge sheared and the door hung crooked the rest of the night. Nobody in 150 houses was still under the illusion that this was going to be a cold morning. The illusion had lasted about 40 seconds. Adelaide Tally put her palm on Rufus's forehead a second time at 4:40 and did not like what she felt. The fever had climbed. His shivering had gone from a rhythm to a stutter, and his eyes, when she lifted the lid, rolled slightly upward before they focused. Verity Lockridge, who had refused to leave the cabin after she and Hollis had parted company in the doorway hours before, was already tearing a clean cotton petticoat into strips and soaking them in the bucket of well water she had drawn at midnight, because a woman who has watched fever before knows a bucket is not a luxury, but an instrument. Adelaide's whisper came from a mother's throat that had already lost one child to a Kansas winter and had been rehearsing all her adult life the sentence she would refuse to say a second time. Verity, he is worse. Verity did not turn from the water. I know. The Thornhill girl said if we could not travel. I know what she said. Verity. Adelaide, listen to me. In this weather, he cannot go 3 miles up a bluff on a wagon. He cannot go 3 feet outside this door. We are going to keep him alive here for as long as we can, and if this house comes apart around us, then we will decide what we do then. Not before. Adelaide's hand closed over Verity's wrist so hard it left a white print. Do not lie to me. I have never in my life lied to you. Promise me you will not leave. I will not leave. The wind found the roof of the schoolhouse at 4:52. Verity Lockridge, who had spent 9 years teaching in that room and who had 3 months earlier replaced 2 split shingles with her own hands because the town would not vote the money for a proper repair, heard the sound of the entire roof leaving the walls from 4 blocks away and understood without a word exactly what she had just heard. Her jaw locked. She did not tell Adelaide. There was no reason to tell Adelaide anything about a building that was no longer standing. She only tore another strip of the petticoat and dipped it and wrung it and folded it and pressed it to the boy's forehead. and did not, would not, could not in that moment allow herself to think about the 6 other children in her class whose parents she had personally warned 3 hours before to keep them home in the morning. Or about the 2 she had not managed to reach in time because a wagon axle had snapped in front of the mercantile and she had had to detour. She thought only about the strip of cotton in her hand. She thought about the water in the bucket. She thought about the boy's next breath. Up on the bluff by 6 in the morning, the true storm had arrived. It came in 3 layers stacked one atop the other, like the pages of a book being turned by a hand no one could see. Snow so fine it moved less like precipitation than like smoke wind so steady, it stopped being wind in any way the ear could still recognize, and became instead a single continuous scream, at the exact pitch a violin makes when the bow has been drawn too long across one string. Cold, that was no longer cold, but a substance, a thing with weight, a thing that entered a body through the eyes and the ears and the mouth, and settled in the marrow and did not leave. The temperature at the cave mouth, according to the small brass thermometer Sable had mounted on the outside of the door frame under a scrap of tin roofing to keep the snow off, had fallen from 10 above at 4 in the morning to 22 below by 6:30. The gauge had a low reading of 40 below in Sable. Checking it at 7 said aloud to no one in particular, "It is going to run out of numbers by nightfall." She wrote it in the notebook anyway. Every hour. Barometric pressure. Wind estimation. Temperature. She wrote in her small, precise hand as if the writing itself were a small act of resistance against the thing outside the door, as if a girl making entries in a leather notebook were a girl who could not, by definition, be lost. Hollis watched her sister work through the first 4 hours of the storm and did not at any moment interrupt her. Makaja, who had spent the same 4 hours moving between the outer chamber and the third chamber, checking the animals, checking the water buckets, checking the fissure where the stovepipe went up through the limestone, in case any drift had begun to build against the outer stones of the fieldstone chimney, came in at last at 8 and sat down at the pine table with the shape of a man who had, without wanting to, begun to think about what a winter of this magnitude was going to do to a town of 150 souls 3 miles south. His good hand shook once around the tin cup. Hollis saw it. She did not comment. At 8:47, a fist hit the oak door from the outside. Not a knock, a single heavy blow as if a body had fallen against the wood. Hollis was up before Makaja could stand both hands on the oak bar, lifting it out of the iron brackets. She had thought about this moment for 11 hours. She had, since coming back up the bluff at 3 in the morning, been counting in her head who might reach the door and who could not. And she had come to peace insofar as she was going to, with the fact that not all of the maps had been read in time. What she had not been prepared for was who fell through the door when she opened it. Josiah Kellerman came through first blue. About the mouth, his beard crusted white to the collar, his boy Theodore under one arm, and his pregnant wife Ada leaning hard on the other, all 3 of them staggering on legs that had walked the last quarter mile only because there had been no other choice. Ada Marston's lips were black. Theodore's small fingers had gone the color of raw pork. Josiah's face, when it emerged from under the drift crust, was not the face of the man who had stood on the porch of the general store 6 weeks earlier, making remarks about goat cheese. It was the face of a man who had spent the last 4 hours revising every opinion he had ever held about a young woman who lived in a cave. Behind him, a woman Hollis had never seen up close came through the door on legs that had gone past the point of feeling themselves a plain gray wool coat, drift-crusted to the elbows. Her graying blonde hair loose around a face gone the color of old paper. Prudence Vance was 31 years old, unmarried, tall, for a woman plain-spoken. She had come to Stoneford Bend 3 months earlier as the assistant teacher because Verity Lockridge could no longer manage 28 pupils alone, and she had spent most of those 3 months keeping quiet in the teacher's lounge because she had understood inside of a week that Verity Lockridge's opinions about the Thornhill sisters were not opinions she shared. She had that morning been at the schoolhouse when the roof came off because Verity had been at the tallies and Prudence had opened the schoolhouse for the false warm morning and had 6 pupils in the room when the wind hit. She now stood inside the outer chamber of the cave, holding on to the pine frame of the door because her legs would not hold her. Her voice shredded hoarse from the wind she had walked into for the better part of a mile. Miss Thornhill, 6 children in the schoolhouse when the roof went. I got them to the willow break half a mile south. I left them there under my coat and my body. I could not carry them further. If somebody does not go now, they are all going to be dead by noon. All of them. Miss Thornhill. Hollis heard the words. She heard at the same time the wind hit the oak door again from the outside and try and fail to move it. She heard Makaja behind her already reaching for his coat, and she heard her own voice level quiet decided, Makaja, you cannot ride. Your good hand froze to the rain yesterday, just going down to the woodpile. You would not make the wagon road. Makaja's mouth opened, closed. He knew she was right. He hated her for one bright second and forgave her in the next. Girl, you cannot go alone. Not in this. I am not going alone. Hollis turned. Her eyes found her sister across the length of the cabin where Sable was already at the shelf pulling down the tin of pine tar, the mustard, the willow bark, the small oiled paper packet of powdered golden seal. Amos Fairbrook's wife had pressed into her hand in September without explanation. Sable did not look up. She only said in a voice so calm it did not belong to a 15-year-old, take Makaja's other rope, the long one, the one grandfather used when he mapped the north face. Tie one end to the iron ring beside the door. Tie the other end to your waist. Do not ride Whistle out. Lead him. He knows the wagon road, but he will not know the whiteout, and if you are on his back and he goes down, you will go down under him. Do you understand? Yes. Take Josiah with you. Hollis's head came up. Josiah Kellerman, who had heard his own name spoken by a girl he had 6 months earlier, said, should not be allowed inside a decent classroom, straightened as best he could against the pine wall he had been leaning on. His voice came rough. I will go. Sable's eyes moved to him. 15 years old, small scarred left hand, still wrapped in a scrap of linen that had gone brown at the palm. Mr. Kellerman, you have walked 4 hours in the storm already. You cannot go back out and come back a second time without losing fingers. But you can take my sister as far as the second fence line. The rope will reach that far. You anchor there. She goes on with Whistle from the fence line. When she comes back with the children, you help her bring them up the last quarter mile. Do you understand what I am asking you to do? I do. Then get your gloves back on. Sit by the stove 5 minutes only, not longer. He did as she said. There was no man in Stoneford Bend that morning who would not have done as Sable Thornhill said. Hollis put on her heaviest coat over 2 shirts and a wool vest. She wrapped a scarf around her face until only her eyes showed. Then she wrapped a second scarf over the first because Elias Kettleworth had written on page 17 that in a killing storm the moisture of one's own breath will freeze the first scarf inside of 10 minutes and become a mask of ice against the mouth. And a second scarf must be layered so that the ice mask can be pulled down and replaced without exposing skin. She did all of it in silence. Sable came to her at the last with a small tin flask of hot milk laced with the last of Makaja's applejack and pressed it into Hollis's inside pocket and did not speak because there were no words that would not have broken one of them, and one of them breaking was not a thing the morning could afford. Hollis put her scarred hand once against her sister's cheek. She turned. She lifted the oak bar. She went out. The scream of the wind was the first thing. The second was the loss of the world. 12 feet from the cave mouth. Hollis could not see the cave mouth. 6 feet from Josiah Kellerman, she could not see Josiah Kellerman. She could not, holding the rope in her gloved hand, see the rope. She only felt the tension against her hip. Whistle stood at her left elbow with his head down and his breath making a small round cloud that the wind erased before it fully formed. She started walking. She counted her steps aloud inside her own scarves because her grandfather's notebook on page 29 had said, "The mind will lose count in a whiteout without the tongue to hold it." 1, 2, 3, 4. She reached the first juniper. She had chosen the junipers as her waypoints when she had drawn the map 3 weeks ago. They stood 22 paces apart down the trail. 22 paces, then 22 more, then a bend, then the fence line. She kept counting. At the fence line, she felt the rope go tight. Josiah had stopped at his end. She dropped Whistle's rein felt for the second rope Makaja had coiled around the mule's neck, tied one end to the fence post, tied the other to her own waist above the first rope. She untied the first rope from her waist and tied it to the same fence post. She tugged the first rope twice hard, the signal she and Josiah had agreed on, for "I have anchored, I am going on." She felt 2 answering tugs. She turned Whistle south along the fence line. The wagon road ran parallel to the fence for half a mile before it curved east toward town. She walked that half mile with her left glove touching the top wire of the fence every third step to keep her line. She counted her paces out loud through the second scarf. When she reached the pace count where she had estimated the willow brake should be off to the west of the road, she stopped. She listened. She could hear nothing but the scream of the violin note. The wind had been playing for 6 hours without interruption. She was about to keep walking when Whistle, who had gone very still behind her, put his nose against her shoulder. Once. Then again. He turned his head to the west, and he made in his throat the single small sound he had made every morning of her acquaintance with him when he wanted breakfast. And Hollis, who had been about to walk past a stand of willows 130 feet off the road, because she could not see them, followed the mule's nose off the road into the field. 20 paces. 40. She fell to her knees twice in snow that had drifted to her thigh. She got up both times. At 63 paces, her outstretched left hand struck a woody branch. She had reached the willows. Under the biggest of the willows, huddled in a shape that looked at first like a single dark rock, were 7 human bodies. 6 children ranging in age from 6 to 11. Above them, wrapped around them, no coat now because it had been laid across. The children was Prudence Vance's plain gray wool skirt, spread out to catch the wind. Prudence herself was not there. Prudence had left the willow brake an hour before Hollis reached it to walk the mile back to the bluff to fetch help, because leaving the children under 2 adults' worth of coat and hoping they lived long enough for help to arrive had seemed to her at that moment the only mathematics available to a schoolteacher who could no longer feel her fingers. The children, when Hollis reached them, were alive. All 6. Barely. The oldest of them, a girl of 11 named Constance Marston, had held the others together by pressing them into the frozen ground under the coat exactly as Prudence had told her to do, and by counting aloud the way Prudence had told her to count so that the little ones would not fall asleep. She had counted to 9,326 by the time Hollis's gloved hand closed around her small wrist. She would remember the number for the rest of her life. Hollis dropped to her knees beside her. "Constance, how many alive?" "All 6, miss." "Which worst?" Emma, not talking. "Can you stand?" "I do not think so." "Constance, look at me. Stand up. I cannot carry you and them both." Constance Marston, aged 11, stood up. She stood up on legs that could not feel themselves. Hollis would remember it for the rest of her life. She lifted the 6 children onto Whistle one at a time. Emma Marston first, tied against her chest with a length of the outer rope, because Emma had gone the color of a boiled potato, and Hollis did not trust her to stay upright, even lashed to the mule's back. The other 5 she balanced in front of and behind the saddle, small bodies pressed against warm mule hide. The older ones instructed in whispers to keep their eyes closed and not let go. Prudence Vance's gray wool skirt she wrapped around all 6 as a single blanket. She took Whistle's rein in her gloved hand. She turned north. She started walking. The rope at her waist paid out behind her along the fence lines she could not see. She counted the return trip out loud through her scarves, the way she had counted the trip out. She did not count the same numbers. She counted her sister's name. Sable, Sable, Sable. 1 for every step. She did not know she was doing it until she reached the fence post where the second rope terminated, and Josiah Kellerman's frozen mitten found her elbow through the whiteout, and Josiah said from somewhere behind her, in a voice that was not the voice of the porch of the general store, "Miss Thornhill, God in heaven, God in heaven." Hollis, whose reservoir was almost empty, said only, "Help me get them up the last piece." He helped her. They walked the last quarter mile with the rope Micajah had lashed to the iron ring beside the oak door as their guide. 6 children on a mule between them. Hollis on one side, Josiah on the other. And when the oak door opened at last inward, at the sound of 2 heavy tugs on the rope, and warm air, the color of yellow lamplight, spilled out into the killing white, Sable Thornhill was standing at the threshold with 6 horse blankets, already warmed by the stove, folded across her arms and behind her. On the pine table, a pot of oatmeal was simmering with the last of the dried apples. In the corner of the outer chamber, wrapped in 3 horse blankets on a pile of hay, was Prudence Vance alive, being tended by Micajah, who had opened the door to her half an hour earlier when she had come up the trail on her own 2 frozen feet the last mile from the wagon road. Micajah Redfern was standing behind Sable with an axe he had picked up. He could not remember when he saw all 6 children come through the door. Alive, he sat down slowly on the limestone floor of the outer chamber, and he put his good hand across his face, and he did not weep, because he had spent the last hour weeping already for Prudence Vance, and had nothing left to spend but his mouth worked once silently in the shape of a name that might have been his dead wife's, or might have been the Reverend's. Sable did not stop moving for the next 6 hours. She took the smallest child, first 7-year-old Theodore Kellerman, whom Josiah had brought with him at 8:47, and who had been sleeping since on a warm blanket beside the stove, and she checked his color and she checked his fingers, and she moved on to the 6 new children in the order of Emma, first, Constance last. She unwrapped each of them from Prudence Vance's frozen skirt and wrapped them in warm blankets and pressed their small blue hands between her scarred left palm and her sound right one until the color began to come back into their fingertips like sunrise over the sandhills, slow, uncertain, real. She spoke to them the whole time in the same voice she had used to read the shepherd's story on Christmas Eve. Theodore, who had woken sometime during the second child, watched his sister Constance being warmed and said in the small croak of a boy who had been too cold to speak for 2 hours, "My daddy said you were crazy." Sable did not stop rubbing Constance's hands. She did not smile. Her voice came out quiet and level. "Your daddy loves you very much. He was wrong about one thing. That is not the same as being a bad man." The boy nodded once. He put his head against her shoulder. He fell asleep again. Sable rocked him for a minute. She reached for the next child. Prudence Vance would not sit down for long. She got up from her pile of hay within the hour wrapped in a horse blanket and would not eat, would not drink the mug of hot milk. Sable had pressed into her hand, would not do any of the things a person who has just walked back from the edge of dying is supposed to do. She only stood and watched Sable warm the children she had covered with her own body, and watched Hollis ladling broth into cracked lips, and watched Makaja shoveling more coal into a stove he had banked to the very top. Her eyes moved from child to child, counting, recounting. Hollis came to her at last with a tin cup of hot water with a small splash of the applejack in it. She held the cup out. "Prudence, I do not drink. You do tonight." Prudence Vance took the cup in 2 hands. She did not lift it. Her eyes filled. Her voice came out quiet enough that Hollis had to lean in. "Miss Thornhill, in October I told my Sunday school class that a family who chose to live in a cave in the year of our Lord 1887 represented a failure to embrace civilization. Prudence, I said it again in the teachers' meeting in November, about your sister specifically, about her cough. I said it about your sister, Miss Thornhill. I said it 2 months ago." Hollis's voice went very soft. "That was 2 months ago. It was 7 weeks ago, tonight when the roof came off the schoolhouse, when I was standing in a room full of children, with no cold stove and no plan. Do you know what I thought of?" Hollis shook her head. "A map, a hand-drawn map, slid under my boarding house door in the middle of the night, in a young woman's hand. That said, if it gets bad enough, come north. You put that map under my door." "Yes." "After what I said?" "Yes." Prudence Vance sat down at last on the pine floor, the way an old woman sits when the knees will no longer hold pride. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She only breathed in long, ragged pulls, as if she were relearning the shape of oxygen. Hollis sat down beside her on the floor. She did not touch her. She waited. When Prudence lifted her face at last, her voice came out very small. "May I stay here?" "Prudence, I mean until the storm is done. I mean, you already have. You covered 6 children with your body in a Kansas blizzard. You did not lose one. You would have died to save them. You almost did." Prudence looked up. Hollis's voice went quieter. "That makes you a woman my grandmother would have loved. In this cabin, that is not a small thing." Prudence Vance closed her eyes. Her whisper came against Hollis's shoulder. "I have not been loved in 19 years. Hollis put her arm around her. "You already are." Dish. They came all night. That was the shape of the 11th into the 12th of January, 1888. They came in 1s and 2s, and sometimes in small clusters along the rope. Hollis had left tied to the outermost fence post along the trail markings. Makaja had renewed at the last minute before the storm closed in along the wagon road, for as long as the wagon road was still a road. Reverend Ambrose Pettigrew came at 2 in the morning of the 12th, leading 4 families from the north end of Main Street, 21 people all alive, all frostbitten to some degree, all having followed a single kerosene lantern. The Reverend had strapped to a broomstick and held over his head for the last mile because his coat had frozen too stiff for him to hold the lantern with his hands. He came through the oak door with his black coat crusted white to the shoulders, and his eyebrows gone the color of cotton, and his voice broken in half. I told him the way. I did not know how many maps there were. Hollis met him at the door with a warmed blanket. There was a map under every door. He stared at her. Child. Yes. How did you carry that many maps? Sable copied them, all afternoon. She knew before I did what I would ask her to do. His mouth worked. He crossed himself. He said quietly to no one and to God, Mercy Kettleworth, are you seeing this? Are you seeing what your granddaughters have done? I walked past Hollis into the outer chamber, where the 21 people he had led up the bluff were already being settled onto horse blankets against the limestone walls, and he sat down beside a woman named Adelaide Talley, whose 14-year-old boy Rufus had come up the trail with the Reverend's group on his own 2 feet through the whiteout because he had refused at his fever to let his mother carry him, and who was now on a straw tick beside the stove being tended by Sable in a way Adelaide had not asked about because Adelaide could not yet bear to ask. He took her hand. He prayed over her son in a voice so soft it was almost singing. Rufus Talley's fever at that point had climbed to 104. Sable had put willow bark tea into him 1 small spoon at a time for the last hour, and she had wrapped his chest in a poultice of mustard and vinegar and pine tar spread across a strip of Louisa Fairbrooks' clean linen, and she had twice already made Adelaide go into the 3rd chamber to eat a bowl of oatmeal and drink a mug of milk because Adelaide had begun to sway on her feet in a way that meant she was not going to be useful much longer if she did not eat. At 3 in the morning, the mayor arrived, Cornelius Ashby alone, his hat missing his right hand, black to the wrist, and swollen inside a glove he could no longer take off. He came through the oak door on his own legs and made it as far as the pine table before he sat down without being asked. He looked up at Hollis. His mouth moved once then again before the words came out. Miss Thornhill, I did not keep it in mind. I owe you. Who had not slept in 22 hours and had lost sensation in her cheeks. Somewhere around midnight said only in a voice that had gone hoarse, Mr. Mayor, sit still. My sister will come look at that hand. Sable came. Sable 15 took the mayor's ruined hand into her scarred one and cleaned it and wrapped it, and did not tell him yet that he was going to lose 2 fingers. Cornelius Ashby, who had signed a deed to 160 acres of worthless bluff 9 months earlier with pity thin as onion skin. In his voice sat in the yellow lamplight with a 15-year-old orphan girl wrapping his frostbite with the last of a torn petticoat, and he did not weep because a mayor does not weep in front of a child who is saving his hand. But his good hand went once gently to the top of Sable's head, the way a father might touch the head of a daughter, and Sable did not look up, and did not stop working, and did not say anything at all. By 5 in the morning of the 12th of January, there were 26 people in the cave. The cabin held 11. The outer chamber held the rest along the limestone walls on horse blankets and hay, and folded coats huddled close enough that the shared body heat of them layered atop the stove heat, and the constant 55 degrees of the limestone itself created in that outer chamber a pocket of survival unlike anything within 100 miles in any direction. The stove burned steady. The air stayed at 60. Sable, who had by then been on her feet for almost 30 hours, sat down at the pine table at 5:15 for the first time and wrote in the leather notebook, barometer holding steady. Wind unchanged, temperature outside -38. Rufus Talley fever down 0.5 degree. Ada Marston contractions, false alarm spaced now every 40 minutes, not every 20, likely will hold. 6 school children, all sleeping. Prudence Vance eating at last. Reverend praying with Widow Talley. Sister has not sat down. Hollis was at that moment at the oak door because a fist had struck it a 4th time that night, and Hollis had, without consciously deciding, to become the person who opened the door. She lifted the bar. She stepped back to let the wind and whoever it carried in. Barnaby Whitlock stood in the doorway. He was not a man anymore. He was the shape of a man carved out of ice by an unkind sculptor. His silver hair had come loose from its tie and hung frozen against his coat collar. His eyes were open. His mouth was open. He was trying to speak. Nothing came out. Nothing. In his arms was a small boy wrapped in 3 horse blankets, not moving. Ozias, 6 years old, silver-haired at the crown, dark-eyed like his mother, feverish enough that his forehead had melted a coin of snow through the topmost blanket where his grandfather's forearm had cradled him for the last mile. Behind Barnaby in the wind stood a woman Hollis had never seen except at a distance from a cave mouth. A woman in a wool traveling coat drift-crusted to the knees, her graying blonde hair loose around a face that had walked 3 miles through a killing wind without stopping and had, according to what Iphigenia Whitlock would tell Hollis 2 months later, over a pine table in a Topeka boarding house, stopped only twice both times to make sure her husband was still on his feet behind her. Iphigenia Whitlock was alive. She had walked in front of her husband and her grandson the whole way, following first the maps she had memorized from studying the paper under her front gate. Then when the whiteout closed in past the second fence line. Following the rope Hollis had tied that morning to the outer fence post when she had gone out for the schoolhouse rescue. Iphigenia had found the rope by chance. She had held on to it with both frozen hands. She had brought her family home along a line a young woman she had never met had laid for her. Josiah Kellerman took the boy from Barnaby without being asked. Makaja stepped in on Barnaby's other side and steadied him by the elbow. Hollis reached past Barnaby for Iphigenia, and Iphigenia, who had held her feet the whole 3 miles by the sheer force of a promise she had made in her own parlor at midnight, allowed herself at last to fold. Hollis caught her under the arms. Reverend Pettigrew was there in 3 strides to take her other side. Together they walked her to the pine rocker beside the stove and set her down in it, and Sable brought her a mug of hot milk without asking. And Iphigenia Whitlock, 66 years old, who had not been permitted by her own husband to sit in a room with him for longer than a supper for 6 weeks, closed her hands around the mug and closed her eyes and did not speak. She did not need to. She had said all the necessary sentences already at midnight in her own parlor, and the walking of 3 miles behind a rope she had never seen laid had been the punctuation. Barnaby's legs went out from under him 3 steps into the outer chamber. He went down slowly the way a great tree comes down more collapsed than fall. He landed on his knees on the limestone floor. His hands were still cupped in the shape they had been in around his grandson. He looked up at Hollis. His voice, when it came at last, was not the voice that had told her from a black gelding in April that she would be gone by August. It was the voice of a man who had waited too long to speak. "Please." Hollis knelt down beside him. She put her scarred palm on the back of his frozen neck the way her grandmother would have done, the way she would understand later. Her grandmother had been asking her to do in a diary entry from 1882. She had read in a moment of decision in July. She said quietly, only for him, "He is with my sister already. She has kept 2 boys out of the grave tonight. She will keep a 3rd. Come in and sit." Ozias Whitlock was on the pine table before Barnaby had steadied his breath. Sable had cleared it in a single sweep oatmeal pot and lamp base, sliding to the floor without ceremony. And she had spread a warm blanket across the pine and laid the boy on it, and she had begun in the same quiet, certain movement she had used on Rufus Talley an hour before. The small, unmiraculous work of trying to save a child from a fever that had ridden a mile through a killing wind, wrapped in 3 blankets against his grandfather's chest. Willow bark tea cooled to warm 1 spoon at a time between cracked lips. A second poultice of mustard and vinegar, and pine tar across a strip of linen wrapped around the small chest. A 3rd blanket warmed on the stove until it steamed laid across the whole small body. Sable pulled up a chair beside the pine table. She sat down. She took his small blue hand into her scarred left one. She began to talk to him. She did not know Ozias Whitlock. She had seen him twice in her life, once on the pinto pony holding to his grandfather's coat, with 2 fists, once on Main Street, the previous September, carrying a paper sack of hard candy from the general store. She had never spoken a word to him. She spoke to him now for the next 6 hours. She told him about the cave, the goats named Buttermilk and Junebug, the mule whistle who had brought a schoolteacher's 6 children out of the willow brake the night before because he had smelled willows through a whiteout no man could see through. She told him about her sister, who could swing an axe better than any man in the county. She told him about their grandfather, Elias Kettleworth, who had drawn the cabin they were sitting inside on page 32 of a notebook in 1867, so that his granddaughters he had never met would have a house that could keep out the killing wind 20 years after he was in the ground. She told him about their grandmother, Mercy, who had prayed for 2 little girls every night for 12 years in a small cabin on this same bluff. Then when her voice began to go, she took a small breath and she told him about his mother. She told him about Delphine Whitlock, who at 18 had loved a young man from the flour mill on the Neosho and had not been permitted to marry him, and who had run away to Topeka and lived in a boarding house on Kansas Avenue, doing piecework by lamplight for 14 years to feed her only child. She told him about the 14 Christmas Eve letters Delphine had written to her father that had come back to Topeka unopened, and how she had kept every one of them in a small pine box under her cot. She told him about the day Delphine had died, the 14th of August, 1882, and how a woman named Mercy Kettleworth, who had never met Delphine, had that same night sat down in a small cabin on this same bluff and prayed for a little boy in Topeka that she had never seen and would never meet. She told him his mother's name over and over in the quiet voice she used to read the shepherd's story. Delphine, Delphine, Delphine. She loved you, Ozias. She loved you every day of her life. She wrote her father your name in every letter he sent back. Barnaby Whitlock was sitting on the limestone floor of the cabin 6 feet from the pine table. He had not moved since Josiah had helped him inside. He heard every word. Iphigenia from the rocker by the stove heard every word also, and her eyes stayed open the whole time, watching her husband's face across the width of the room. Barnaby's whole body seized once. He did not make a sound. He only put his forehead down against his own knees, and his silver hair hung loose around his face like a curtain, and his shoulders shook in a way that had no rhythm at all. Reverend Pettigrew, who had drifted in from the outer chamber sometime during the second hour, sat down on the limestone floor beside Barnaby without touching him. Hollis at the stove, tending the willow bark, said nothing. Micajah in the doorway had not moved for 2 hours. The room held around the pine table the way a congregation holds around a pulpit. At 3 in the morning of the 13th of January, 46 hours after the first gust had struck the cave-mouth Ozias, Whitlock's fever broke. Sable felt it under her palm on the child's forehead, the way a farmer feels a change in the wind before he has understood what has changed. She lifted her scarred hand very slowly. She did not speak. She only looked across the table at her sister, who had been standing at the stove for an hour with a fresh cup of willow bark tea she had not yet needed to pour, and Hollis, who had been reading her sister's face for 12 years, understood before a word was spoken and set the cup down. Ozias's breathing had gone from the fast, shallow rasp of high fever to the slower, even rhythm of a child who is not going to die tonight after all. Barnaby Whitlock lifted his forehead off his knees. His eyes were red and wet, and something else, something older, something that had not been in his eyes for 45 years. Sable's voice came across the pine table, quiet, calm. Exact, Mr. Whitlock. He is going to live. Barnaby made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man breaking cleanly in half at a place that had been cracked for so long the crack was structural. Hollis moved. She sat down on the limestone floor beside him. She reached into her apron pocket without saying a word and drew out her grandmother's Bible, which she had at some point in the last 12 hours, without deciding to begin carrying on her person. She opened it. She turned to the page marked in careful pencil the entry for August 14th of 1882, and she handed it to him with the ribbon still between the pages. Barnaby took it in shaking, frozen hands. He held it in his lap for a long moment before he could make himself look down. He read the entry. He read it twice. On the second reading, his shoulders began to shake in a way that had rhythm now. He whispered into the black leather cover in a voice hardly above breathing. She forgave me. 45 years ago. She forgave me. Hollis's voice was quiet, yes. I did not deserve. That is how you know it is real. Miss Thornhill. Yes. I paid a boy $2 silver in July to burn your woodpile. I know. I paid him again in October to leave a dead skunk in your goat pen. It did not stick. I did not know that one. There was more. There was more than I can list. I have been trying to run you out of this town since the afternoon you walked into it. I have been trying to run you out because you had your grandmother's mouth, and your grandmother's mouth said the word no to me a long time ago in front of a peach tree that has been dead 30 years, and I could not. His voice broke. I could not carry a no for that long, so I made it a hate, and it ate everything. I know. You knew before I said it. Yes. How? Because my grandmother prayed for you. Because a woman does not pray for a man 45 years unless she has understood what shape his pain is. Barnaby Whitlock, at 68 years old, cattle baron husband, grandfather to a boy alive tonight on a pine table, only because a 15-year-old girl he had once wished dead had spent 6 hours saying his own daughter's name aloud to his own grandson, put both hands over his face and wept into them, the way a man weeps when there is no one left in the world to hide from anymore. Iphigenia Whitlock stood up from the rocker at the stove. She crossed the room slowly, because her feet were still not entirely her feet, and she sat down on the limestone floor beside her husband, and she put her arms around him, and Barnaby, who had not been held by his wife in 6 weeks, and had not deserved to be held for longer than that, folded into her without resistance, the way a coat folds when the shoulders come out of it. They did not speak. They did not need to. Sable at the pine table was still holding Ozias's small hand in her scarred one. Reverend Pettigrew, still seated on the limestone floor, closed his eyes and without any theatrics blessed the room with a whisper only the closest three could hear. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. The wind outside kept up its steady violin note. It had been screaming for 46 hours. It would scream for another 2 days. The storm broke on the morning of the 15th of January. 5 days. 5 days of a wind that had made the small brass thermometer beside the door irrelevant sometime on the second afternoon when the mercury had passed the low mark on the gauge and simply stopped reporting. 5 days of a scream so continuous that when it stopped at 7:42 in the morning of the 15th, the silence itself woke every person in the cave who had managed to sleep. The sun came up over Kansas that morning and lit a world nobody recognized. Drifts 15 feet high, fences buried, barns collapsed, whole houses in the smaller sections south and west of Stoneford Bend erased down to the ridgeline as if the prairie had reconsidered whether they had ever been there. Makaja opened the oak door at 8 in the morning because someone had to be first, and he had decided sometime during the third night that it was going to be him. He stepped out into a light so bright off the new snow that it hurt his eyes for a full minute before they adjusted. He walked to the cave mouth and stood there in the sunlight and did not say anything because there were no adequate words for what he was seeing. And Makaja Redfern had never been a man who spoke when the words available to him were inadequate. Behind him, Hollis and Sable came out. Reverend Pettigrew came out. Then Iphigenia Whitlock came out alone without her husband because Barnaby had asked her to go and see, and she had understood without needing to ask why. Down at the base of the bluff, 3 miles to the south, Stoneford Bend was smaller than it had been on the 9th of January. Some of the roofs were gone. Some of the houses were gone. The church steeple still stood, though the bell tower had come off in the third night and lay across the churchyard like a fallen tree. The schoolhouse was a bare rectangle of foundation stones. The digging out took 8 days. On the second day of it, a search party found Rufus Talley's cousin, a boy named Wilkin, who had lived with an uncle 3 miles east of town and who had not been at the Talley house on the 11th, frozen upright against the north wall of his uncle's barn, half a mile from the house he had been trying to reach. He was 15 years old. On the fourth day, they found the Peterson twins, aged 8 and 8, who had been sent to fetch the mail from the roadside box in the false warm morning of the 10th and had never come back. Their mother had not slept in 5 days. She did not sleep on the 5th day either. Reverend Pettigrew buried them. He buried all 14. He was 72 years old. He would not sit down for a burial. He would not let anyone else say the words. He said to Prudence Vance, who tried to help him on the 4th day, "These are my sheep. I will bury my sheep." He said it once. Nobody asked twice. At the end of every service, he said the same closing. "The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Amen." By the last of them, he could barely stand. Prudence Vance held his elbow. Verity Lockridge held the other. Nobody said anything about it. The three of them were without any of them, yet knowing it, walking together into the rest of a working partnership that would run 29 years. Barnaby Whitlock buried nobody of his own that week. Iphigenia had walked in front of him the whole 3 miles through the storm and had not fallen. Ozias had lived. What Barnaby buried instead over the first 2 weeks of February, when the ground had thawed enough to break, was a habit. He walked from his 16-room house to the small back cottage where his ranch foreman used to live, and he asked the foreman if he could move into the cottage, and the foreman, who had known Barnaby 30 years and had never once seen him ask a question with please in it, said, "Yes, sir, of course." Barnaby moved into the 2-room cottage that afternoon. He brought a bed, a stove, a pine table, a stack of children's books he had bought from a catalog in St. Louis over the past 4 winters and had never had the courage to give to Ozias, along with Ozias and Iphigenia, and nothing else. He gave the 16-room house to the foreman's family. He said to Ridge Calloway, no, to Makaja Redfern on the porch of the cottage the day of the move. One hand on the porch rail, one hand at his side, in the same voice he had used at 3 in the morning of the 13th of January, when he had asked forgiveness of a young woman he had once wished dead. Makaja, a man who owes as much as I owe, cannot be seen carrying his old life into his new one. Makaja, who had not laughed in 9 years, laughed. It was small, it was his. Barnaby came to the cave every week that spring. Not with proposals, with small things, a jar of preserves he had made himself. Badly, a shelf he had carved. Uneven. Ozias to visit and sit at the pine table with Sable, who taught him to read a pressure gauge and eat cornbread with butter. Barnaby would sit by the door with his hat in his hands. Just watch. Just breathe the same air as his grandson and the two young women who had opened the door for them in the storm. Iphigenia came sometimes, sometimes did not, because Iphigenia had, since the storm begun, the work of putting her own life back together in a way that did not require her husband's presence to complete a sentence, and Hollis, watching that work happen at a distance across 5 months, admired it in the exact way her grandmother would have admired it, and did not say so out loud because there was no need. In September, on the 14th, the anniversary, Barnaby had not spoken aloud in 6 years. He came to the cave alone. He said at the door, "Miss Thornhill." She said, "Mr. Whitlock." He said, "I have been thinking about the school." She said, "Which school?" He said, "The one I have not yet built." She said, "Sit down." He sat. She poured coffee. He drank it slow. He said, "I do not know yet if I love those children the way I need to. I know I have started to. I know when I look at Ozias, I no longer see just my daughter's face. I see a friend's face, other children's faces, the Tally boy's cousin's face." He stopped. He steadied. "I saw the Peterson twins in a dream last night. I do not deserve to dream about them. But I did. I woke up and I thought if those boys had been mine, if I had raised them, I would have loved them. I did not, because they were not mine. Now they are dead. Miss Thornhill, there are more like them in this county. There are dozens. I have money. I have land. I have a house that could sleep 40 children. I would like to try before I die if you will help me." Hollis set down her coffee. She said, "That is the right reason." He said, "You will help." She said, "We will build a school. It will be named for my grandmother. It will start in your house. It will take foundlings from any county in Kansas. It will be run by a board. You will not be on the board, neither will I. But we will both live on the grounds, and we will both work, and you will not ever pay me $1. He said, "May I hug you?" She said, "Yes." He stood. She stood. He hugged her. He was 68. She was 22. He held her the way a father holds a daughter he has just gotten back from a very long trip. He held her a long time. He said into her hair, "Thank you." She said, "You will thank her, not me." He said, "I have been thanking her every night." She said, "Good." The Kettleworth School for Foundlings opened on the 1st of April, 1889. Reverend Pettigrew said the blessing. He then sat down on a chair Makaja Redfern had built for him because he could not stand for very long anymore. Verity Lockridge stood at the door of the front hall and welcomed the first 16 children. Prudence Vance stood beside her. They came from 3 counties. They came in wagons and on foot. One small boy came on the back of a mule with a handwritten note pinned to his coat that said, "His name is Nate. His mother is dead. His father is gone. He is 6. He is a good boy. He does not speak much. Please be kind." Prudence took him inside. She fed him bread and butter. She set him on a chair by the fire. She said, "You are safe now." He looked up at her. He said, "I know." She almost dropped the plate because those were the first words he had spoken in 11 days. The school grew. 16 the first year, 24 the second, 39 the third. Sable left in the fall of 1890. She was 18. She wanted to go to college, which was in 1890 in Kansas, for a woman, an unusual thing. The University of Kansas at Lawrence had admitted women for 18 years. It had produced exactly 3 female graduates in the sciences during that time. Sable wanted to be the 4th. She wrote her application in her own hand, sent it in the mail, got a letter back 3 weeks later that said in polite university language that they were not accepting female applicants to the geology department at this time. She read the letter twice. She folded it. She put it in the stove. She watched it burn. She wrote another letter, not to the university, to Barnaby Whitlock. "Grandpa Barnaby, I need your help. Not with money, with something harder." He wrote over that afternoon. He read the university's letter. He said, "How much do you want this?" She said, more than anything. He said, I know a man on the Board of Regents. His wife died in the blizzard of '88. He was one of the 14. I mean, his wife was. He blames himself. He always will. I have written him twice a year for 2 years, Christmas and Easter, just to say, I know how it is. He said he will listen to me if I ask him to listen to you. That is all. He will not admit you because I ask. He will read your application because I ask. Then he will decide, because that is the kind of man he is. Sable said, that is fair. He said, may I write him? She said, yes. He wrote him. The regent wrote back in a week. Sable went to Lawrence in September. She sat in front of 8 men in a wood-paneled room and answered every question about mineralogy and thermal mass and the geology of the Kansas Flint Hills for 2 hours. When she was done, the youngest of them, a professor, 34 years old, newly appointed, leaned back in his chair and said, Gentlemen, I am prepared to accept Miss Thornhill. If any of you wish to object, I would like to hear it now, because after today, I will not entertain it. None objected. She was admitted. She was the 4th female geology student at the University of Kansas. She was the first to graduate with honors. She published her first paper in 1896, a study of prairie thermal storage in limestone formations. The dedication read, for my grandfather, Elias Kettleworth, who saw it first. For my grandmother, Mercy Kettleworth, who believed it would be seen again. For my sister Hollis, who built the door. For Barnaby Whitlock, who taught me that a man can be rewritten. Barnaby Whitlock died in the summer of 1900. He had spent his last morning helping a 9-year-old girl named Cora fix a broken door hinge on the chicken coop. He had told her the name of her favorite hen, Mrs. Pickett, and asked if Mrs. Pickett was laying well this week. She said yes. He said good. He said, you take care of Mrs. Pickett, and she will take care of you. That is the whole of everything in one hen house. Cora laughed. He walked back to the cottage. I took an afternoon nap. He did not wake up. Cora found him. She sat with him for an hour before telling anyone. She said later, when she was 52, telling her own grandchildren the story, that she had wanted him to have some quiet before the noise, because he had earned that. Ozias Whitlock was 19 at the funeral. He spoke at the graveside. He said, my grandfather was not always a kind man. He became one. That is a harder, better thing than being born kind and staying that way. I was my mother's father. In the last 12 years, he became my mother's son. That is the only inheritance any of us really leave. Iphigenia Whitlock stood beside Ozias with her hand on the small of his back. She would live another 4 years. She would die in 1904 in the same rocker. Hollis had sat her in on the morning of the 13th of January, having asked to spend her last week in the cabin because she said she had walked 3 miles in a killing wind to reach that room once, and it did not seem right to die anywhere else. Hollis sat with her the last night. Iphigenia's last words were, tell Mercy I finally understood. She will laugh. She always did. Hollis told her, every night, for 31 years. Reverend Ambrose Pettigrew died in 1912. 96. He preached his last sermon 2 Sundays before. Prodigal son. Not a face in the room was dry. His last words to Hollis were, your grandmother is very proud of you. She held his hand until he stopped breathing. She went outside. She looked up at the sky. She said out loud, grandmother, he is coming home. Meet him at the gate. The wind stirred the leaves. She took that as an answer. She always did. Micajah Redfern died in 1984. Bad heart. Found on his workbench in the school woodshop with a chisel in his good hand and a half-carved rocking horse in front of him. It was meant for a boy named Elijah who had just turned 6. They finished the horse and gave it to Elijah anyway. Elijah kept it his whole life. Verity Lockridge died in 1922. 75. Pneumonia, head in Hollis's lap, hand around the small tin cross she had worn since the storm. Her last words were, tell the children I was wrong about the cave. Write about them. Hollis told them, every single one in person. She went to 14 states over 3 years because Hollis Thornhill would not send that message in a letter. Prudence Vance took over the school. She ran it for 11 more years. She died in 1933, 67. Her last words were addressed to a photograph on her bedside table that had been taken in 1918, of all 4 of them, Hollis and Sable and Verity and Prudence, standing in front of the Kettleworth School front hall with 52 children ranked on the steps behind them. She said to the photograph, I got to stay. Thank you for letting me stay. Then she closed her eyes. Hollis Thornhill died on the 9th of March 1935. She was 69. She died in the small keeper's cottage behind the main hall in the brass bed she had slept in for 41 years with her sister's hand in hers. Sable had come home from Berkeley in February when the letters had started to sound worried. Hollis was ready. She had written a letter to every one of the 47 children she had raised. Some of them were 60 by then. Some were teachers, some were mothers, some were fathers. One was a judge in Chicago. She had given Sable her grandmother's Bible. She had said, "Keep it going. Whatever you do with your life, keep it going." Sable had said grandmother's prayers. Hollis had said whoever's prayers, the habit, the paying attention to other people. Keep it going. Sable had nodded. She had said, "I will." They buried Hollis beside the cave. Not in the churchyard in town. Not next to Prudence or Verity or Makaja or the Reverend, though she had loved them all. Beside the cave. On the bluff. Above the mouth of the limestone hollow where she had at 21, in a Kansas January, opened an oak door for 26 people and kept them alive. Sable stood at the graveside. She was 63. Her hair was white. Her hands trembled. Her burned palm ached in the cold. She held her grandmother's Bible against her chest through the whole service. When it was over, everyone walked back down the bluff. Sable stayed. She sat down on the flat rock outside the cave mouth, the same flat rock Reverend Pettigrew had brought a peach cobbler to on a July afternoon 48 years before. She opened the Bible. She turned to the last blank page after Revelation, the page Mercy Kettleworth had ruled with a small pencil grid so long ago. She took out a small pencil. She wrote in her own hand in the careful script her sister had taught her when she was 6. March 9th, 1935. Lord, my sister Hollis has come home to you. She is with grandmother now. Please tell her the cave still stands. The school still opens on the 1st of April. 47 children have grown up under her hand. 10 of them have children of their own. 3 of those grandchildren start at Kettleworth in the fall. Please tell her the fire is still lit. I will keep it going. Amen. Your granddaughter, always Sable. She closed the Bible. She held it against her heart. She looked up at the sky. The sun was setting over the Kansas prairie. Gold pink, a soft dying orange. A hawk circled once high and dropped down the valley toward the town. Sable stood up. She put the Bible back in her bag. She spoke to the plaque that would be set into the limestone wall the following summer. She spoke to the grave. She spoke to the mouth of the cave. She spoke to the meadowlark somewhere down the bluff that was singing a song her grandmother had heard, and her grandfather had heard, and her sister had heard every summer of her 69 years. She said, "Sister, the cave is still warm." She said, "The school is still open." She said, "The fire is still lit." She said, "Grandmother has stopped waiting." She said, "She is laughing at the days to come." She walked down the bluff toward the wagon, toward the town, toward the school, toward the 48 children waiting for supper. Behind her, the mouth of the cave held steady at 55 degrees. It always would.